The anime begins by introducing us to the protagonist named Naofumi, who is a 20-year-old college student who doesn't usually go out because he is an otaku. And in that it is revealed to us that he still lives that his parents, they give him an allowance so he doesn't have to look for a job. And after this presentation, we see how Naofumi decides to visit a library so he can read light novels. But when he tries to grab one of these, he accidentally knocks over several books. So Naofumi decides to pick up one of the books that he knocked down on the floor, which is titled The Four Sacred Weapons. And when interested in the title, Naofumi decides to open it to read it. And there he realizes that the story of the book talks about 4 heroes, which come from another world, and each one has a sacred weapon, being a sword, a spear, a bow, and a shield respectively. And in that it is revealed to us that these are in charge of saving the world from the enemy waves. And after this, Naofumi decides to continue reading the book. But when he tries to read the shield hero's information, he notices that it is empty. And at that moment the book begins to shine. And there Naofumi is transported to a kingdom called Melramark within a fantasy world, where he is received by several priests, which reveal that they have summoned him along with 3 other boys to save their kingdom. So there Naofumi notices that he and the others are the 4 heroes of the sacred weapons, being him, the hero of the shield. And there we see how the priests ask him for help because their world is in danger, to which the other heroes respond by saying that they are willing to listen to them. However, they do not plan to work for free. So the priests tell the boys that they will soon have a meeting with the king, so that they can negotiate with him, what the boys accept. And after a few hours, they meet with the king of Melramark called Alt, which asks the legendary heroes to come forward. And in that we see that the sword hero is called Ren, the one with the spear is a boy named Mitoya, and the one with the bow is called Itsuki. And after the presentation of these, Naofumi tries to introduce himself. However, Alt ignores it, which makes Naofumi realize that the shield hero is not that important. And after this, Alt tells them about an apocalyptic prophecy of this new world, which says that several waves of destruction will arrive. So, if they fail to avoid these waves, the world will come to an end. And then Alt tells the kids about the hourglasses from the Age of Dragons, which are found in each kingdom, and announce when the waves will arrive. And after this, Alt comments that the first wave arrived in this kingdom, and there the soldiers of the kingdom managed to resist it. But knowing that the second and third will be worse, they decided to invoke the heroes. And their Alt mentions that the next wave will be in less than a month, this being the reason why the heroes must become stronger by then. And with that the boys decide to agree to help them in exchange for a great reward, to which the king accepts, and then he asks the heroes to check their stats. And in doing so, the boys realize that this world is like a video game, so they must level up to become stronger, and at that the boys decide to form a team. However, they are stopped by Alt's advisor, which tells them that these must become strong separately, since legendary weapons repel each other. So, if they fight together, a negative reaction occurs immediately, which means that traveling together prevents them from growing optimally. And after this, the counselor asks the kids to rest for the rest of the day, so that you can prepare to start your adventure tomorrow. And then at night, we see how the heroes gather in a room to talk. And there each one mentions that this world is similar to a video game that only they know, which makes everyone confused. And after talking for a while, they realize that they all come from a different world. So it is revealed to us that each one comes from a different Japan. And in that Naofumi notices that he is at a disadvantage, since the other heroes know a game similar to this world unlike him. And there the boys mention that the shield hero is the most useless of all, since this one has the worst legendary weapon, which makes Naofumi upset. But then he decides to calm down and get good travel companions. And after this, Naofumi is motivated because his adventure will soon begin. And then the next day, the boys meet with Alt, who has gathered his best warriors to join each hero's team. So in that each warrior begins to choose a hero. And after a while, Naofumi realizes that no one wants to be on his team, since rumors are spreading that he knows nothing about this new world. This being the reason why no one trusts their abilities. So there the heroes find out that their conversation last night was exposed. And then Naofumi begins to get upset because he won't be able to level up on his own. But at that moment a girl from Mitoya's group named Main shows up. And there she decides to team up with Naofumi, which makes Naofumi surprised. And after this, Alt decides to give each hero money for their travels. And he decides to give Naofumi more than the rest because he doesn't have such a big team. And after this, we see how the heroes begin their journey. So the others say goodbye to Naofumi and wish him good luck. And after this, Main decides to show the capital to Naofumi, so that he can become familiar with this new world. And there Naofumi decides to go to a weapons and equipment store. So Main takes him to a guy named Erhard, which is a blacksmith who runs a weapons and equipment store. and there he recognizes Naofumi as the hero of the shield. So he tells Naofumi that he has had bad luck. However, Naofumi decides not to let his comment affect him, and there he asks Erhard to show him a weapon that he can use. So Erhard shows him several swords made of different minerals. But when Naofumi tries to grab a sword, it immediately repels him. And there Naofumi realizes that he can only use his shield as a weapon, so he must fight alone using his shield. And at that Erhard asks Naofumi if he can take it off, to which Naofumi responds by telling him that he can only move it around. However, he is unable to remove the shield from his body. So after this, Naofumi decides to buy only one adventurer's outfit, and then Main tells him that it's time to level up. So they both go to the outskirts of the capital to gain experience. And once outside, Naofumi finds some low-level monsters known as balloons, which attack him without hesitation. However, they are not able to hurt Naofumi thanks to their shield. So Naofumi takes advantage of this to take his time and defeat them with his fists. And after several hours, Naofumi uses one of his shield's abilities, with which he absorbs the balloons he defeated to obtain new abilities. And then, Main tells Naofumi that they should buy equipment for her, since this way they could fight stronger monsters, to which Naofumi accepts. So they return to Erhard's store, and there Naofumi begins to negotiate with him in order to get a discount on your purchase, which makes Erhard surprised by Naofumi's ability. And after this, we see how Main decides to buy some quite expensive equipment, and there she convinces Naofumi to buy them because they will be able to recover that money. So Naofumi decides to pay for everything. And after this, Naofumi asks Erhard where he can sell the remains of balloons, to which Erhard tells him about a monster materials store. So Naofumi manages to recover a little of his lost money, and then at night, he decides to have dinner with Main. And there they begin to organize their plans for tomorrow. And after this, Main proposes a toast to Naofumi. However, Naofumi decides to reject it, since he doesn't drink alcohol, and their Main tries to convince him. But Naofumi rejects his proposal again. And upon hearing his response, Main tells him that he really is a hero, and there she reveals that in Melremark women are superior to men. So men do not usually reject drinks offered by women, which makes Naofumi surprised. And after this, Naofumi decides to go to sleep. But before leaving, he thanks Main for deciding to be part of his team. And then the next day, Naofumi prepares to go out and level up. However, he notices that his money and armor are missing. So Naofumi starts looking for him everywhere. And then he realizes that everything was stolen from him. So Naofumi decides to look for Main to warn him about this. But then several soldiers from the castle appear in front of Naofumi, and there they tell him that the king needs to talk to him. So he is urgently taken to the castle, where he meets Main and the other heroes. And in that Main mentions that Naofumi drank too much last night, and after this, he tried to abuse her. So she escaped and asked Matoya for help. And upon hearing this, Naofumi is amazed because he does not understand anything. And in that Naofumi tries to tell everyone that it is a misunderstanding. However, Alt orders him to remain silent, and there we see how Main secretly mocks Naofumi, which causes him to get angry knowing that she only used and deceived him. And there Naofumi asks the king to return him to his world and summon a new hero, to which Alt responds by telling him that that is not possible, since they can only summon another hero if the current 4 die, so these can only return if they stop all the waves of destruction. And there he mentions that sexually abusing a woman is punishable by death. However, being a hero, Naofumi cannot receive this punishment, since the next wave will soon come. So his punishment will be that everyone in the kingdom knows of his crime, so that his reputation is tarnished and everyone hates him. So at that point Naofumi decides to take care of the waves in his own way. And there he decides to retire from his castle after having lost everything because of Main. And once outside, all the citizens begin to view him with contempt. And in that Naofumi is stopped by Erhard, who tries to hit Naofumi for what he supposedly did to Main. But upon seeing his look, Erhard realizes that Naofumi is not guilty, so he decides to help him by giving him a new outfit. And there Naofumi thanks him and tells him that he will pay him back at some point. And after this, Naofumi goes to the outskirts of the capital, where he begins to fight against several balloons. And after many hours, Naofumi manages to rise to level 2. And there Naofumi decides to take with him several live balloons. Since having a bad reputation, merchants try to scam you. So he begins to threaten them using balloons, in order to have the treatment of a normal person. And then, Naofumi manages to earn a little money with which he pays Erhard. And after a few days, Naofumi finds some special plants, so he decides to absorb them with his shield. which allows him to gain a new ability and better understand his powers. And there he manages to improve the quality of the plants he touches due to his new power. So in that he sells the plants at a good price after using his gathering skill. So after this, Naofumi decides to have dinner in a tavern. However, he realizes that food has no taste for him since he was betrayed. And then we see how 3 adventurers interrupt their dinner. And there they decide to follow Naofumi outside the tavern to try to steal his money. So Naofumi uses the balloons and his shield to defend himself. And after chasing them away, Naofumi notices that he lacks offensive force, which makes it alter. But then a guy named Balaukas appears in front of Naofumi, and there he makes a proposal to Naofumi when he notices that he needs a partner. So he asks Naofumi to accompany him to his warehouse, where he reveals that he is a slave trader, and there he tells him that these have a curse, which prevents them from disobeying their master's orders. So upon hearing this, Naofumi becomes interested in Balaukas's proposal. And there he decides to show the slaves, revealing in the process that some of them are demi-humans, which are beings half human, half beast. And there Balaukas recommends a slave to Naofumi, which is a powerful level 75 beast. So upon seeing her, Naofumi asks her how much it costs, to which Balaukas responds by telling him that it costs 15 gold coins, which makes Naofumi ask him why he showed him a slave he can't pay. And there Balaukas tells him that he thinks he will become a frequent customer. So he wants Naofumi to see his best product to train his eyesight. And after this, Balaukas asks Naofumi what kind of slave he wants, to which Naofumi responds by telling him that he wants a cheap and obedient one. So at that Balaukas tells him that then he will have to buy a demi-human. But there Balaukas mentions that these do not specialize in combat, so Naofumi must train him. And in that Naofumi finds a little slave named Raphtalia, who is physically and mentally ill. So Balaukas believes that she will not last long alive. And there Naofumi decides to buy Raphtalia, which makes Balaukas surprised. And after this, we see how he decides to start the ritual, in order to officially return to Raphtalia, Naofumi's slave. And after doing so, he tells her that now she will not be able to disobey him. And there Naofumi notices how now Raphtalia has become his companion, which will allow you to share your experience with her when they fight together. And after this, Naofumi decides to take Raphtalia with him. And then he visits Erhard, whom he asks to sell him a weapon and new clothes for Raphtalia. And after this, Naofumi asks her to stab one of his balloons, which causes Raphtalia to get scared and not want to do it. But then her slave seal activates and begins to make her suffer. So Raphtalia is forced to attack the balloon until it is destroyed, causing both to gain experience in the process. And then, Naofumi tells her that she will fight monsters from now on, since he also needs to recover the money he invested when buying it. And after this, Naofumi and Raphtalia leave Erhard's store. And once outside, he notices that Raphtalia is very hungry, so he decides to take her to a restaurant, where he asks for the cheapest dish for himself and Raphtalia asks for a more expensive dish, which makes Raphtalia surprised to see everything he can eat. And after this, they both go out to level up fighting several balloons, so their Naofumi manages to gain experience faster than before. And then they decide to rest. And their Naofumi notices that he has gained the ability to combine different ingredients, so in that he thinks it could be useful. And at that moment Raphtalia decides to ask Naofumi who he is, to which Naofumi responds by telling him that he is the hero of the shield. And upon hearing this, Raphtalia begins to remember her parents, which told them that the shield heroes were kind and valued demi-humans. So Raphtalia is happy to know that she met the shield hero in person. And after this, Naofumi gives him a medicine that he has just created with his skill, in order to cure Raphtalia of her illness. And after this, we see how Raphtalia is sleeping. But then she begins to remember her past, where we see how Raphtalia witnesses the first wave of destruction. So she begins to flee from the monsters with her parents. However, they are cornered by a large monster, so the parents decide to sacrifice themselves in order to save Raphtalia. And after dreaming this, Raphtalia wakes up completely upset, which causes Naofumi to calm her down by telling her that she is now safe. And then the next day, Naofumi sells the medicine he prepared the day before, so this one manages to make some money. And after this, Naofumi meets with Raphtalia, which is watching some children playing with a ball, so he asks her if she wants one, to which Raphtalia responds by saying no. However, Naofumi realizes that she is lying, so he buys her a ball. And there he tells her that he can play with her when they finish working, for which Raphtalia is happy. And then at night, Naofumi and Raphtalia go to an inn to sleep in a room, and there he is forced to threaten the owner with one of his balloons, in order to be accepted with Raphtalia. And then we see how both begin to spend the days gaining experience, and there they meet a rabbit, which tries to attack Raphtalia. So Naofumi intervenes to stop him, and there he asks Raphtalia to stab the rabbit with his dagger, which makes her scared because she is afraid of blood. And by not obeying Naofumi, Raphtalia begins to feel pain from her seal. And then Naofumi tells her that he won't be able to take care of her if she can't fight, since Naofumi needs someone else to fight for him. And upon hearing this, Raphtalia decides to stand up again. And there she stabs the rabbit while telling Naofumi that she will fight for him, since she does not want Naofumi to abandon her. And after this, Naofumi decides to visit Erhard to buy Raphtalia a sword, because Naofumi wants to visit a new town. So after this, they both visit the neighboring town called Ryut, where he sells rabbit fur for 2 silver coins. And there Naofumi asks the seller for a place to make money easily. And upon hearing this, he tells her about a mine that contains valuable minerals. However, a dangerous monster from the first wave has been living there, this being the reason why no one has entered the mine again. So there Naofumi decides to explore it to collect minerals. But before that, Naofumi begins to experiment with his new abilities, with which he manages to create a shield of ropes and one of air. So there he decides to use them to survive the mine. And after this, he enters the mine with Raphtalia. And once inside, Naofumi manages to collect several valuable stones. So he is happy because he will be able to sell it at a high price. But in that moment he observes how Raphtalia is paralyzed with fear. And at that moment we see how a monster appears, which is similar to the monster that killed Raphtalia's parents. So Raphtalia starts screaming out of fear, and there Naofumi decides to hold her to escape from the monster. And in that Raphtalia talks to Naofumi about his past, which makes Naofumi understand why she is so scared. But then Naofumi tells Raphtalia that she must defeat the monster, since he must get stronger, in order to stop the waves and prevent other children from experiencing what she experienced. And at that moment Naofumi decides to stop the monster using his body, and by doing so, he asks Raphtalia to take advantage of the opportunity to kill him. However, Raphtalia is paralyzed with fear, so she begins to suffer from the curse of being a slave. But seeing that she is very terrified, Naofumi decides to give up. So Naofumi asks him to flee while he stops the monster, and there Raphtalia realizes that if she runs away, Naofumi will die like his parents, and in that she begins to remember her days with Naofumi, which makes her regain her will to fight. So there Raphtalia attacks the monster with his sword, and in that Naofumi uses his air shield to stop the monster, which allows Raphtalia to cause a wound to the monster with which she eliminates it. So there they manage to gain a lot of experience, and after this, Raphtalia hugs Naofumi while crying since she feels relieved to see that Naofumi is still alive. And a week after this event, we see how Naofumi heads to the field with Raphtalia in order to continue raising the level, and in that we see how he traps a monster in a shield prison, which allows Raphtalia to eliminate the enemy easily. And there it is revealed to us that Raphtalia has grown a lot in a short time, which has caused his personality to change as well. And after this, we see how Naofumi and Raphtalia visit Erhard, who is asked to create armor for Naofumi, since his current clothing is not capable of protecting him from all the attacks he receives. So Erhard recommends one of his best armors. However, Naofumi notes that it is very heavy, so he asks Erhard to make him a suit of armor, and there Erhard mentions that he will have it ready for tomorrow. And after this, Naofumi and Raphtalia go to dinner at a tavern, where Naofumi asks for a children's dish for Raphtalia. But then Raphtalia gets angry while telling her that she is no longer a girl. So there she orders the same dish as Naofumi's. And then the next day we see how Naofumi receives the armor made by Erhard, which is known as Armor of the Savages. And in that Raphtalia is amazed to see how great Naofumi looks. And then we see how several soldiers begin to patrol the entire area, since these are preparing for the arrival of the next wave of destruction. And there Naofumi mentions that he could make a plan if he knew when the wave would come. And upon hearing this, Erhard tells him about the Church of the Kingdom, which has the hourglass that announces the arrival of the wave. And there he reveals that at that moment the heroes and their allies will be transported, in order to be present in the wave. And after hearing this, Naofumi decides to visit the hourglass. And once there, he notices how the watch reacts to Naofumi's shield, which causes Naofumi to be able to observe the time left for the next wave. And in that we see how Matoya appears with his allies. And when he sees that Main is there, Naofumi gets upset. So there Naofumi decides to leave the site. But before leaving, Matoya asks Raphtalia if she has heard the rumors about Naofumi, which makes her look confused. However, Naofumi decides to take Raphtalia with her. And then they meet Ren and Itsuki, those who ask him not to get in the way during the wave. And later at night, Raphtalia asks Naofumi if something happened between him and the other heroes, to which he responds by telling her that he doesn't need to know that. So Raphtalia decides not to continue putting pressure on him. And then the next day, we see how the warriors prepare for the wave. and there Raphtalia decides to talk with Naofumi, to whom he tells that he is glad to have met him, since he has done a lot for her, this being the reason why she is very grateful. And there Raphtalia tells Naofumi that she will be his sword, so she will follow him anywhere. And after this, we see how the time comes, which causes the wave of destruction to arrive in the kingdom. So with that, the heroes and their allies are transported to the battle zone, where they observe how various monsters begin to appear. So Naofumi decides to go defeat them. However, Raphtalia realizes that the Ryut village is under attack, so Naofumi decides to go to Ryut to protect the villagers with Raphtalia. And once there, Naofumi orders Raphtalia to evacuate the villagers, since he will be in charge of distracting the monsters in the area. And then Naofumi begins to defend several villagers while attracting monsters. And then he decides to head towards a big tower which begins to climb by means of a ladder. And once at the top, Naofumi begins to ring a bell in order to attract the attention of all the monsters. So they begin to climb the tower to kill Naofumi. And there Naofumi throws gasoline all over the tower, and then start a fire. So after this, Naofumi escapes from the tower using his rope shield, which allows you to defeat several monsters. And in that we see how the villagers regain their will to fight when they see Naofumi, so they try to help him. But then we see how a huge monster appears, which causes Naofumi to be forced to intervene to stop him and protect the villagers. And there Naofumi asks the villagers to move back, since they will not be able to defeat the monsters. And in that we see how Raphtalia appears to help Naofumi, so they begin to defeat all the enemies by fighting as a team. And at that moment we see how several of the king's knights appear to help Naofumi. And meanwhile, the other heroes fight against the strongest monster of the wave, whom they manage to defeat after fighting together, which causes the wave to end. And after this, we see how all the villagers begin to thank Naofumi because without his help, they would not have survived. And after this, Raphtalia mentions that now others will not have to go through what she went through, to which Naofumi responds by saying yes. So he congratulates her for her work during the wave, which makes Raphtalia start to cry with joy. And then at night, we see how the king organizes a great feast for the 4 heroes, where we see how Naofumi attends only to receive his reward. However, Raphtalia appears in front of him to encourage him to try the party food, which makes Naofumi not feel alone. But at that moment Matoya appears and challenges Naofumi to a duel, since he heard the rumors that Raphtalia is his slave, this being the reason why Matoya wants to free her. And upon hearing this, Naofumi mentions that in this world slavery is allowed, so he decides to reject his duel. And there Matoya tells him that a hero should not have slaves, this being the reason why he insists on challenging him. So Naofumi to leave the party, but then he is stopped by the kingdom's soldiers on the orders of Alt, which decides to carry out the duel between the 2 heroes. And there Raphtalia tries to tell them that this duel is not necessary, but then she is stopped by the soldiers with the excuse that she does not know what she is saying. So there Naofumi is forced to accept the duel to recover Raphtalia. And then we see how he and Matoya enter the arena. And then Matoya attacks Naofumi using various abilities of his spear. However, Naofumi manages to withstand their attacks and counterattack using the balloons, which begin to hurt Matoya. And after this, Naofumi uses his new various shield abilities, with which he manages to pressure Matoya. So Naofumi gets the advantage of the battle. But then he receives a surprise attack from Main, which allows Matoya to recover and deal a serious blow to Naofumi, thus managing to win the duel. So Naofumi mentions that Main has interfered in the fight. However, no one decides to believe him, so Alt removes the slavery curse from Raphtalia. And there it is revealed to us that Main is actually the daughter of King Alt, this being the reason why Alt does everything to please her, which makes Naofumi feel desperate. But at that moment Ren and Itsuki interrupt Matoya's celebration. And there they reveal that they saw Main's actions, which were overlooked thanks to Alt. But with the intervention of Ren and Itsuki, it is demonstrated that Matoya lost the duel, which allows Raphtalia to return to Naofumi. To those who say that they will always be their ally, they never plan to leave them. So their Naofumi is happy to have someone to trust. And then the next day, Raphtalia delivers a meal to Naofumi, which he prepared with the leftover food from yesterday's party. And upon tasting it, Naofumi realizes that his taste for food has returned, which makes him happy. And after this, we see how the heroes are gathered in front of Alt, which offers rewards to all heroes except Naofumi. So Itsuki and Ren decide to defend Naofumi again, since he saved the Ryut people during the wave. So Alt is forced to give Naofumi the minimum reward. And after this, Naofumi and Raphtalia go with Belaukas, since Raphtalia wishes to have the curse again as a slave, to which Naofumi tells him that it is no longer necessary. However, Raphtalia mentions that she wants to show him her loyalty that way. And after this, Belaukas advises Naofumi to buy an egg from a Philolial, which is a race of creatures that load transports in the city. And their Balaukas mentions that if he's lucky, he might get a dragon from one of the eggs. So their Naofumi decides to buy an egg from Philolial. And after this, he visits the witch of the capital, which thanks him for saving his grandson and Ryut. So she gives him a grimoire, so that Naofumi and Raphtalia can learn magic in this world. And after this, the boys decide to spend the night in Ryut. And then the next day, we watch as Philolial's egg hatches. And in that, a Philolial is born, whom Naofumi decides to name as Philo. So Naofumi begins to take care of her for 2 days. And after this, we see how Philo has grown a lot in a short time, which makes Naofumi and Raphtalia amazed. But in that we see how Main and Matoya appear in Ryut. And there she announces that now this town belongs to Matoya by order of the king. This being the reason why everyone will have to pay very expensive taxes, which makes the villagers angry as they disagree with this. So Main decides to order to eliminate those who oppose him. But at that moment royal messengers appear and bring a message to Main. And after reading it, Main decides to challenge Naofumi to a duel for control of Ryut, which consists of a 3-lap race around the town, to which Naofumi rejects the proposal. But after receiving so much insistence from the villagers, he decides to accept. So Naofumi makes a race riding Philo against Matoya and his dragon. And in that we see how several soldiers of the kingdom cheat, so that Naofumi loses the race. However, he manages to overcome all obstacles, which allows you to reach the goal first. And there Naofumi realizes that Philo has become even bigger, so he is amazed. And after this, the governor of Ryut gives Naofumi a carriage and a license, with which you can enter several towns and cities without paying anything. And then, Naofumi decides to continue with his journey. But the next day, we see how Philo has turned into a little girl. And after this it is revealed to us that Philo is an aspiring queen of the Philolial, this being the reason why she is special among her species. And then, we see how Naofumi visits Erhard, to whom he tells that he needs special clothes for Philo, since she rips her clothes every time she transforms. So Erhard recommends that they go see the seamstress in the capital. But once there, she tells them that they need a magic thread, which is created using a magic stone that is very difficult to find. So Naofumi decides to trade products in different towns in the meantime. And along the way, the boys meet a man in trouble, since he must bring medicine to his people. So their Naofumi tells him that he will help him if he gives him something in return. And in that Naofumi decides to take the man using Philo, which allows them to reach the nearby town in a short time. And once there, Naofumi gives the medicine to the man's mother, causing her to feel much better, for which the Lord thanks you, and there he gives him a bag full of vegetables as payment for helping him. So at that point Naofumi realizes that he can use Philo to his advantage, since they could transport people and loads in emergency situations. So after this, we see how the boys start to work taking trips, which allows them to save money. And then, we see how they transport a merchant named Hick, who reveals to them that Naofumi has become known as the Saint of the Bird God, since he is in charge of healing the sick in a carriage pulled by Philo. So Naofumi is surprised to hear this. And then Raphtalia announces to Naofumi that several bandits are blocking the way. And there they reveal that they want to kidnap Hick, so Raphtalia and Philo decide to defeat them using magic. And after this, Naofumi threatens to kill them all, which causes the bandits to begin begging for their lives. And their Naofumi decides to spare the lives of the bandits with one condition, which consists of giving them everything they have stolen to use it to your advantage. And then, Hick decides to pay Naofumi by offering him all his knowledge and contacts, which allows Naofumi to grow as a merchant and learn about jewelry. And after this, Naofumi manages to receive information about the stone that makes magical thread. So he decides to go to the mine where the stone is located, together with the witch. And once there, they encounter a huge chimera which they manage to defeat by working as a team, and there they manage to collect the special stone which allows them to get the magic thread to make Philo's clothes, for which Philo thanks Naofumi. And after this, the boys travel to a town in the south, since these must transport a special product in order to eliminate some plants that extend throughout the town. And once in the town, they are received by the governor, who tells them that the plants have negatively affected the people, since these are causing illness in the villagers. So they ask Naofumi for help as a saint of the bird god. And then Naofumi begins to cure the villagers using the special product and his magic. So everyone thanks him, but before the boys leave, the governor stops them, and there they ask him to save his people from the plants. And in that they reveal that before they were starving, so Matoya appeared with a special seed weeks ago which grew to provide enough food for all the villagers. However, the seed grew so much that it spread throughout the town, reaching the point of affecting the villagers. And their Naofumi decides to solve Matoya's mistake in exchange for a reward, and once outside the town, the boys begin to fight various plant monsters. And after this, they manage to find the seed, so the boys start fighting together to defeat her. And in that, Naofumi uses the product along with the power of his shield, which allows him to destroy the threat of the town. And after this, Naofumi manages to modify the seed. This allows it to create fruits for the people without it being a danger in the future, for which everyone thanks Naofumi. And then, Naofumi meets with Hick in order to sell part of the fruits and seeds that he was able to collect, which allows you to benefit after this deal. And after this, Naofumi visits a city of hot springs in order to transport a load there, and after delivering the load, the boys decide to take a bath in the hot springs, and there Raphtalia begins to feel jealous of Philo, since she has become very close to Naofumi. And then Raphtalia decides to look for a special mineral on his own, in order to give it to Naofumi as a gift. But once on the outskirts of town, she meets Philo, which is looking for an egg to give to Naofumi. So then they both begin to walk through a mountain until they find what they are looking for. However, they encounter an aggressive monster, which destroys the objects that Raphtalia and Philo were looking for. So they get angry and decide to hunt him down. And once back in town, they both decide to sell the monster in order to buy a metal tool for Naofumi. So he thanks them both for the gift. And after this, we see how the boys continue with their journey throughout the kingdom, and then they meet a man with his son. To those who decide to give food when they see that they are in poor condition. And there he tells them that they should not go to the town that is in front of them, because if they do, they could die from a serious illness, which comes from an epidemic that has recently appeared in the town. And in that, Naofumi decides to visit that town when he is interested in the epidemic. And once there, they are greeted by a villager, who is amazed to see that Naofumi is the healer that everyone talks about. So he decides to take Naofumi to the town doctor, who is happy to see that Naofumi has come with new medicine, since what the doctor believes is not enough to save them all. And there Naofumi decides to try his medicine while using part of his magic with the grimoire, which makes one of the sick feel much better. So Naofumi gives the medicine to the rest of the sick, and after this, Naofumi receives 50 silver coins from the people, this being all the money they had left. So Naofumi decides to accept them. And after this, he asks the doctor if they don't plan to do anything for their people, since Naofumi knows that the villagers will get sick again soon, to which the nurse responds by telling him that he already knows. However, they can't do anything about it. And there she mentions that the cause of the epidemic is due to a mountain dragon, which was killed by the sword hero Ren a month ago. And after this, the dragon's corpse rotted and became toxic, which caused the air to become poisonous, and it reached the town. So Naofumi realizes that the epidemic is due to Ren's mistake. And their Raphtalia asks them why they don't do anything if they know the cause of the disease. To which the nurse responds by saying that more dangerous monsters live on the mountain, which makes it impossible for any villager to enter the mountain. And after this, she reveals that the dragon's poison changed the ecosystem of the area, this being the reason why the mountain has now become unknown to everyone. And their Naofumi asks the doctors if they have already notified the government of this, to which the doctor responds by saying yes, so these will soon send medicine to the people. And their Naofumi asks them to cancel that order, since he will be in charge of saving the town on his own in exchange for receiving a large payment, which is 500 silver coins. So the doctor is surprised to hear this, but then Naofumi tells her that she will receive what they plan to pay the government. And after this, the boys enter the mountain to look for the dragon. And after a while, they encounter several monsters blocking the way. So Naofumi decides to cover Philo with his protective magic, so that she can pass through the monsters so as not to fight them. So after this, the boys manage to advance, and their Naofumi tells Raphtalia that she should stay behind since she's starting to feel sick from the toxic air. However, Raphtalia decides to continue with Naofumi, and then they find the corpse of the dragon. So the boys decide to clean the place. But at that moment, the dragon begins to regenerate, and there the boys realize that he has woken up as a zombie dragon. So Naofumi tells Raphtalia that they should go back. But then Philo appears and kicks the dragon, causing great damage. And there she reveals that she hates dragons very much, and that the dragon shoots its poisonous breath. So Naofumi tries to protect the girls with his shield. However, the poison begins to affect Raphtalia as it passes through Naofumi's defense. So Naofumi begins to wonder if he should retire or continue fighting. But there Philo gets angry and tries to fight the dragon, and at that moment we see how the dragon devours Philo, which causes Naofumi to remember the moments he spent with her. And then Naofumi gets angry when he thinks that Philo has died. So this one unlocks a shield known as the Rage Shield, which gives him great power. However, Naofumi loses control, so he starts attacking the dragon with all his fury, which causes him to receive a lot of damage from the fire of the Rage Shield. And seeing him in that state, Raphtalia begins to worry about Naofumi, so she decides to stop him. which causes Naofumi to regain consciousness. But then he notices how Raphtalia is in poor condition. So there Naofumi begins to use his magic to heal her. And in that the dragon tries to attack Naofumi, so he defends himself with his shield, and there he realizes that without the shield of rage, he will not be able to defeat the monster. However, he begins to doubt when he knows that he could lose control again. So Naofumi wonders what he should do. But at that moment we see how the dragon falls defeated, and there it is revealed to us that Philo was in charge of defeating him from within, since she realized that the zombie dragon's core was a purple crystal, so Philo decided to eat it. And after this, Naofumi and Philo decide to get rid of the dragon, which makes the air in the area stop being toxic and the town is saved. And back in town, the doctor gives the reward to Naofumi, to which he responds by asking him to take it as payment to cure Raphtalia. However, the doctor mentions that Raphtalia has a powerful curse, so Naofumi must visit a church in a big city in order to obtain high-quality sacred water to cure it, so Naofumi decides to accept the doctor's reward. And after this, Naofumi meets with Raphtalia and Philo, and there the latter gives him a piece of the crystal that was inside the dragon, so he decides to make his shield absorb him, which causes him to receive a skill that he cannot yet use due to his low level. So Naofumi wonders what this ability is about. And then the next day, we see how the boys come from carrying out an assignment. And there Naofumi tells Raphtalia that tomorrow they will return to the capital in order to get the sacred water to cure it. And after this, the boys meet a girl named Melty, which is excited to see Philo. So Philo starts playing with Melty. So Naofumi and Raphtalia decide to go ahead and go to town. And then at night, we see how Philo returns to Melty, which asks Naofumi to take her to the capital since she separated from her escorts because she was playing with the Philolial in the area. And there Naofumi decides to accept, since knowing that Melty belongs to royalty, he will be able to collect a great reward. So after this, we see how the boys begin to travel back to the capital, and once there, Melty thanks Naofumi, and there he sends Philo to accompany Melty and collect the reward, since Naofumi plans to visit the church with Raphtalia. And once at the entrance to the church, Naofumi notices that it only honors 3 heroes. So there he realizes that he has been left out again, but he still decides to enter the church, where he is received by the archbishop, who congratulates him for the duel he had against Matoya. However, Naofumi ignores him and asks for high-quality sacred water. And there he pays a gold coin for it. And after this, the boys decide to leave the church, but then a young soldier named Ake appears looking for Naofumi. And upon witnessing this, Naofumi decides to flee with Raphtalia, since he considers that he is being wanted for having done something bad, so Naofumi separates from Raphtalia so that she is safe. But once alone, Naofumi is attacked by Matoya, who is upset with Naofumi. And there he asks him to free Philo, since he thinks she is one of his slaves. And in that we see how Matoya's attacks cause great damage to the city, so there we see how Ake appears and asks Matoya to stop. And in that Main intervenes and declares the authority for Matoya and Naofumi to fight. Since she wants to get her way, however, Melty appears, mentioning that she does not accept his order. And in that it is revealed to us that Melty is Main's younger sister and the heir to the throne. So everyone is forced to obey his orders. And after this, Matoya meets Philo, whoever asks to stay away from Naofumi. However, Philo shows him his true form and kicks him, and after this, we see how Melty meets alone with Naofumi and the others, and there she tries to talk to him. However, Naofumi tells her that he has nothing to talk to her about. So he asks him to leave, since Naofumi does not trust royal people. And there Melty tries to ask Naofumi to listen to her, but then several of Melty's bodyguards appear. And there they tell her that King Alt is calling her, so upon hearing this, Melty is forced to retreat. So she says goodbye to Philo, and there the girls ask Naofumi why he didn't want to talk to her. But he ignores the question. And in that Naofumi asks Philo not to meet with Melty again, which makes Philo not understand Naofumi's actions. So at that point she gets sad and decides to go out for air. And there Naofumi begins to remember the bad things that royalty has done to him, which makes him mention that they can't trust them. And after a while, we see how Philo enters Erhard's store again, and there she tells Naofumi that she has a visitor. So in that we see how Ake appears with other soldiers. And upon seeing him, Naofumi asks him what he wants from him, to which Ake responds by asking him to allow them to fight him in the next wave, since they were amazed to see how Naofumi fought in the previous battle. And there Naofumi tells them that if they want to fight in the wave, they don't need to join him. However, Ake mentions that they want to fight at his side, since all the soldiers present come from Ryut. So Naofumi saved his families during the first wave, this being the reason why they want to thank him for saving their people. And at that Naofumi decides to ask them for 150 silver coins, because if you give him that amount, he will accept you into his group. So Ake and the others are amazed. but still they decide to go and collect the 150 silver coins. And after this, Naofumi decides to improve his armor with Erhard. But then he notices that a star has appeared when he reaches level 40. So there Erhard explains that at level 40 he must upgrade his class, because if you don't do it, you won't be able to level up as you have reached the growth limit. And there Erhard tells him that class promotion takes place in the hourglass of the church. So the boys decide to go there. And along the way, Naofumi asks Raphtalia what class upgrade she wants, to which Raphtalia responds by telling her that he can choose the one he wants for her. But then Naofumi tells her that she must decide her potential for herself, because when the waves end, he will return to his world. This being the reason why Raphtalia must choose a class that allows her to live alone. And upon hearing this, Raphtalia begins to worry, since she does not want Naofumi to leave her world. And then, we see how the boys reach the hourglass, and there they find out that they must pay 15 gold coins for each class upgrade. So the boys are surprised to hear this, but still Naofumi decides to pay for the class upgrade, so he asks Raphtalia to go up class first. And there he delivers the 15 gold coins, but at that moment they are stopped by a nun, which mentions that the Shield Heroes group is prohibited from classing up, since this was declared by the king himself, so Naofumi is forced to retire with his money. And after this, he visits Belaukas, who asks if there is any way to upgrade, since Naofumi remembers that Belaukas has a level 75 slave, to which Belaukas responds by telling him that he cannot help him. But then he tells her that she can upgrade her class in the hourglass of another kingdom. And there Belaukas recommends 3 kingdoms to raise your class, however, it would take a long time to reach any of them, which makes the trip impossible since the 3rd wave will soon come. So Naofumi decides to discard this idea for now. And there Belaukas recommends some flying dragon claws for Philo, which will increase your strength during combat, so Naofumi decides to buy them. And after this, Naofumi takes an order from Belaukas to test Philo's claws, so the boys are going to marry a monster that is in the sewers. And once there, they begin to fight together, and at that moment we see how Philo defeats the monster with his new team. So she is happy, and then at night, Naofumi puts the bandages with holy water on Raphtalia so that she can be cured of the dragon's curse as quickly as possible. And there Raphtalia asks Naofumi if she can accompany him to his world when everything is over, which makes Naofumi surprised. But before Raphtalia can say anything else, Philo interrupts the conversation. So there Naofumi decides to end the talk. And after this, we see how the boys travel to a northern town to carry out an order. And once there, they meet some villagers in poor condition. And there they reveal that Itsuki caused a revolution with a group of rebels. Since there was a corrupt governor in the town, however, the group of rebels took control, which caused the situation of the town to worsen. So Naofumi decides to help them. And after this, he returns to the capital with the girls, where they meet Ren and Itsuki, which mention that someone else collected their rewards for their missions, so Naofumi starts laughing at them. And there Itsuki and Ren decide to confront Naofumi. And at that moment Naofumi tells them about the group of rebels and the dragon's corpse. So there they realize that because of them, many people have died. However, Itsuki decides not to believe Naofumi, so he decides to leave the tavern. And after this, Naofumi receives a new armor from Erhard, which has a zombie dragon core on its chest, and then we see how Ake and the others appear with the 150 silver coins. So they decide to give them to Naofumi. However, Naofumi asks them to use that money to buy better equipment. And there he accepts them on his team, which makes Ake and the others happy. But then he tells them that if they betray him, they will pay dearly, what the boys accept. And after this, we see how the boys prepare for the next wave. So there Naofumi gives a new accessory to Raphtalia and Philo, which are responsible for increasing your statistics. And after this, the boys are transported to the wave area, where we see how they begin to fight against the monsters around them. And once there, Naofumi meets the old woman he cured some time ago, which reveals to be a retired adventurer, so she manages to defeat several monsters with her fists easily. So Naofumi is surprised to see how strong the old woman is. And there she tells him that she will take care of the monsters in the area with Ake and the others. So Naofumi decides to go with the other heroes to defeat the boss of the wave. And in that he finds a huge floating ship where the other heroes are fighting against the strongest monsters. However, in that we see how Ren and Matoya do not know how to fight as a team. So Naofumi decides to intervene to tell them that they must fight together, because if they don't, they won't be able to survive the wave. And then Naofumi notices that the monsters around him have strange shadows, so he orders Raphtalia to use her light magic, to which she accepts. And in that we see how Naofumi discovers that weakness is found in his shadows, so everyone starts attacking them, which allows them to defeat all the monsters, but then we see how the boss of the wave called Soul Eater appears. So all the heroes try to hurt him using electricity magic. However, the Soul Eater manages to resist all of its attacks. So Naofumi asks Philo to use his wind magic, and in doing so, she manages to hurt the Soul Eater. So he gets angry and attacks the heroes. However, Naofumi and the girls manage to stay standing thanks to the legendary shield. And there Naofumi decides to use the Shield of Rage to defeat the Soul Eater, and by doing so, he awakens a new power thanks to the zombie dragon fragment. And on the other hand, Philo transforms because she also consumed the purple crystal, so in that the boys begin to have the advantage of the fight. And at that moment Naofumi uses a new ability called Iron Maiden, with which he locks the Soul Eater in a prison of shields, and then he uses an Iron Maiden to finish off the Soul Eater once and for all. So upon seeing this, the other heroes are amazed at the power of Naofumi, and after a while, we see how the wave has not yet disappeared, and at that moment a mysterious girl named Glass appears, which recognizes Naofumi as the only hero of the kingdom, and there she presents herself as his enemy. And then Glass decides to fight Naofumi. So there she tells him that now the real battle of the waves begins. And at that moment we see how the three heroes try to attack Glass, however, she stops his attacks with ease. And after this, Glass uses a skill with which he knocks out the three heroes, leaving only Naofumi and the girls standing. So at that point he begins to fight Glass alongside Raphtalia and Philo. However, Glass proves to be far superior, which causes Raphtalia and Philo to fall to the ground defeated. So there Naofumi decides to activate his anger shield, so Philo gets up and attacks Glass with the power of the dragon crystal. But then Glass stops her and knocks her out again. And then she uses a special attack against Naofumi, which he manages to stop thanks to his shield, so Glass congratulates Naofumi for having endured his attack. And in that Naofumi decides to use the Iron Maiden, but by locking Glass, she destroys the maid with great ease. So Naofumi decides to create a strategy to escape with the girls. And in that we see how Glass decides to allow them to escape since the time of the wave is over, so there she tells Naofumi that next time he will not be saved. And after this, we see how the wave ends, which makes Naofumi wonder what the Olas really are. But then a soldier appears asking him to appear before the king. So after this, Naofumi meets with Alt, who asks him where he got so much power to defeat a boss alone. To which Naofumi responds by telling him that if he wants to know, he must kneel before him, which causes Alt to get angry with Naofumi. However, he tells him that he now has the strength to kill him easily, so Naofumi decides to leave the throne room. And there Alt tells him that then Raphtalia and Philo will pay for their lack of respect. But then Naofumi threatens him, saying that if he does anything to them, he will kill him. So Alt is forced to remain silent, and after this, Naofumi meets with the girls in Erhard's store since he must prepare to travel to another kingdom and be able to upgrade his class. And after this, the boys embark on their new journey, where we see how Erhard left several gift accessories for everyone, which will help you move forward more efficiently. And after this, the boys decide to rest, but at that moment Melty appears with several royal soldiers, and there she asks Naofumi to return to reconcile with King Alt. To which Naofumi responds by refusing, and at that moment Naofumi notices how a soldier tries to kill Melty, so he decides to protect her. And there it is revealed to us that all this is a conspiracy made by Main, so that everyone thinks that Naofumi has taken Melty hostage, since Main plans to take the throne after killing Melty using a false story, so in that Naofumi decides to protect Melty. And after this, we see how throughout Melremark they show a false video where it is shown how Naofumi and the girls murder Melty's bodyguards in order to kidnap the princess, which means that the boys are now wanted throughout the kingdom. So after a few days, Melty mentions that she will return to the capital to talk to her father. However, Naofumi tells her that if she returns, she will be killed. So he suggests that she travel with them, since this way Naofumi will be able to protect her, so Melty accepts. And in that Naofumi decides to travel to another kingdom called Siltveld in order to find a refuge. And after walking for a while, the boys decide to rest. And there Melty asks Naofumi why he hates King Alt so much, to which Naofumi responds by telling him what he has experienced since he came into this world. And upon hearing this, Melty mentions that his mother asked Alt to treat him well, so she is surprised to hear the treatment Naofumi has received from Alt. And then the conversation is interrupted when Naofumi notices that there are soldiers around. So he decides to continue walking secretly with the girls. But along the way, Melty trips and causes noise, which causes them to be discovered by Melremark's soldiers. So the boys try to escape, but then they come to a cliff. And at that moment the three heroes appear accompanied by Main, which lies saying that Naofumi brainwashed Melty, this being the reason why she is now on his side. and the heroes decide to believe Main, so they begin to fight against Naofumi and his allies. And in that, Naofumi decides to use the Shield of Anger, with which he manages to create a rift between his group and the other heroes, which means that they cannot reach the boys. But before leaving, Naofumi talks to Ren, and there he tells him that he should be able to understand why all this has happened, which makes Ren think about Naofumi's words. And after this, Naofumi and the girls take refuge in a safe place in the forest. And at that moment, a special Melty escort named Shadow appears, who tells Naofumi that he must go see the Queen of Melramark, which is located in the opposite direction to the Siltvelt Kingdom, so Naofumi begins to doubt. And on the other hand, we see how Main gathers several soldiers and magicians in the forest so that they light a mountain and thus try to make Naofumi and the others leave. And there Naofumi notices the fire, so he decides to continue advancing with the girls before the fire reaches them. And then the next day, Naofumi goes to buy supplies and gather information. And there he finds out that they closed the checkpoints and there are patrols at the borders, this being the reason why it will now be difficult to go to Siltvelt. And upon learning this, Naofumi meets with the girls to talk to them about what he heard. And there he decides to go see the Queen of Melramark, and after advancing a little, the boys arrive at an area where many demihumans live, which makes Melty remember that she has a noble friend in this region. So she tells the boys that he can help them. But then Raphtalia begins to remember her village, which was invaded by several rebel soldiers after the first wave, so there Melty realizes all the corruption that exists in her kingdom. This being the reason why you begin to feel bad for not having done anything. But at that moment a nobleman named Van appears, which turns out to be Melty's noble friend. So he invites the boys to talk at his mansion. And once there, Van finds out the true current situation of the boys, since he heard that Naofumi burned the mountain to escape, so there Naofumi realizes that Main blamed him again for something he didn't do. And after this, Van orders to bring food for the boys, so the girls get excited when they see this. However, Naofumi tells them that the food could be poisoned, so their Van decides to try a bite of Naofumi's food, so that he can trust him. And upon witnessing this, the boys decide to eat, and then they start talking. And their Van mentions to Melty that traveling with Naofumi has made him change for the better, since before I always tried to act like a responsible adult, so Melty is embarrassed to hear this. And then Van sends the boys to the room. And there Melty asks Naofumi why he doesn't rest, to which he responds by saying that they could be attacked at any time. And at that moment Raphtalia tells him that she will watch in his place, to which Naofumi accepts and decides to go to bed and rest. So Melty gets angry when she sees that Naofumi still doesn't completely trust her. And there Philo asks Melty to accompany her to explore the mansion, to which she accepts. And on the other hand, Raphtalia asks Naofumi to treat Melty kindly. However, Naofumi decides to ignore her and continue sleeping. And then at night, we see how Naofumi wakes up. And there he meets Melty, who tells him he doesn't know if he should just be running away. Since being part of royalty, she still has many things to do, but then Naofumi tells him that right now the priority is to escape, so she can think later about what she should do. However, Melty still continues to feel bad for not being able to do anything for her kingdom. So Naofumi asks him to rest a little, and there he tells her that he is sure that there is something that only she can do. So Melty decides to thank him, and after this, Naofumi notices how Raphtalia still continues to have nightmares about her past. So there he realizes that he hasn't gotten over it yet. And then the next day, Raphtalia wakes up from her nightmare, and there Naofumi mentions that they are in trouble, since several soldiers are taking Van, and just then, Van's servant appears in the room. And there he tells them that a nobleman from the neighboring city accused Van of helping Naofumi, this being the reason why they are taking him away. And then the maid decides to hide Naofumi and Raphtalia in the kitchen, in order to prevent the soldiers from discovering them. And at that moment Melty appears to talk to the soldiers, which reveal being at the service of a nobleman called Idol, which is about the man who enslaved and tortured Raphtalia when she was little. This being the reason why Raphtalia gets angry, but at that point Naofumi stops her to avoid being discovered. And there Melty decides to cover up Naofumi, so she goes to Idol's mansion to prepare her trip to the capital, which allows Naofumi and Raphtalia not to be discovered. And after this, they meet Philo, which was hidden by Melty so that it would not be discovered. So at that moment Naofumi decides to trust Melty and go save her. And then at night, we see how the boys infiltrate Idol's big mansion, so at that point they begin to defeat several of their bodyguards. And along the way, Raphtalia begins to remember several moments from her past. But still she decides to keep moving forward, and after this, the boys manage to find Melty in Van, so Idol tries to threaten them with killing Melty. However, Naofumi saves her with great ease, so Idol gets angry at them and threatens to kill them. But then Raphtalia decides to face Idol on her own. and seeing that he can't beat her, Idol begins to beg for his life, which makes Raphtalia remember the demi-humans who also asked him for mercy, so she gets even angrier. And in that, Idol remembers that Raphtalia comes from the town of demi-humans that he invaded, so he tells her that if he hadn't bought them, they would have died of hunger. However, Raphtalia asks him to remain silent, since she still hasn't forgotten all the torture she received, so their Idol decides to kneel to ask Raphtalia for forgiveness. However, she begins to be blinded by hate, so Naofumi decides to intervene. And there she asks Raphtalia if killing Idol will help her get over her past. And after this, he tells her that she not only became strong as a swordsman, so upon hearing these words, Raphtalia comes to her senses. And there Raphtalia tells Idol that if she kills him, she will become a coward like him. So she decides to spare his life so that he can live it by paying for his crimes. But then Idol gets angry when he feels humiliated by a demi-human, which makes him decide to attack Raphtalia dirtily. So she starts to defend herself. And then Idol accidentally trips over one of his weapons, which causes him to fall into the cliff from his window. So there Naofumi tells Raphtalia that it is not her fault. And after this, Melty decides to cure Van, which mentions that they should run away right now, but before that, the boys decide to go to Idol's basement, since there were the semi-human slaves that he tortured, and then the boys decide to go in there. And at that moment, Raphtalia begins to remember her past, where we see how she decides to be positive after the death of her parents, since this way you can encourage the villagers to rebuild their town after the first wave. So at that, Raphtalia gives a speech to everyone so that your town can once again be as prosperous as before. And there one of her friends named Keel decides to support her. And in that, Raphtalia's best friend named Rafana also supports her idea, which causes everyone to be encouraged to rebuild the town. And after this, everyone notices how several soldiers approach them, which makes the villagers think that this is help from the king. However, these turn out to be Idol's soldiers, which appear to capture all the demi-humans and use them as slaves. And after this, Raphtalia is locked in the basement with Rafana, where they begin to be tortured daily by Idol. However, Raphtalia decides not to lose faith, so she mentions to Rafana that the shield hero will come to save them one day. And there Raphtalia notices how Rafana begins to get sick after so much torture, but still she tries to encourage her to continue fighting. So Raphtalia gives him a small flag made of waste from the cell, which represents the flag that belonged to the people of both, so Rafana is happy to receive this. But one day, we see how a soldier looks for Raphtalia since she has been sold to the slave trader Balaukas, so Raphtalia begins to ask the soldier what will happen to Rafana. However, the soldier ignores her and sends her out of the mansion. And after this, we return to the present, where Van reveals that there are still 3 surviving slaves, so the boys rush to go help them, and in that we see how one of them is Keel, so Raphtalia is glad to see that he is still alive. However, Keel cannot recognize her as she has grown so much, so Raphtalia reminds him of the moments they lived together in their town, which makes Keel realize that it really is Raphtalia. And after this, Naofumi decides to heal Keel's wounds, so Keel is glad to see that the shield hero really exists. And there he mentions that Rafana would have loved to meet him, and upon hearing this, Raphtalia asks what happened to her, so Keel decides to tell him the truth. And after this, we see how Raphtalia heads towards the cell where Rafana was, but once there, she only finds Rafana's corpse, which causes Raphtalia to start crying. And on the other hand, Melty is horrified to see what is happening inside her kingdom. And there Van tells him that this happens in more than one place in Melramark, which makes Melty amazed. And after this, Naofumi tells Raphtalia that they must give Rafana a proper burial. But then Raphtalia begins to feel guilty, because if she had been stronger, Rafana and many others would be alive. However, Naofumi tells Raphtalia that she has not done anything wrong. And there he tells her that if he hadn't met her, he wouldn't have been able to trust anyone. So Raphtalia is surprised to hear this. And then Naofumi tells her that they will not allow there to be more children like her, which makes Raphtalia regain his will to fight. So with that, Raphtalia decides to say goodbye to Rafana officially. And after this, the boys leave Idol's basement in order to escape from the mansion, but at that moment it is revealed to us that Idol is still alive. And there he activates a monument that keeps a monster sealed inside. And at that, Idol undoes the seal since he wants to take revenge on Naofumi and Raphtalia. And at that moment we see how an ancient dragon called Tyrant appears, which crushes Idol with a single stomp. And after this, the tyrant begins to cause a great disaster throughout the mansion. So the boys decide to hide in a safe place with the demi-humans. And then Naofumi begins to wonder what they should do now. But then the tyrant appears in front of them, which makes Naofumi surprised that he found them so quickly. And then he realizes that if the tyrant attacks them, they will be lost. But at that moment Philo quickly approaches the tyrant to attack him, and there Naofumi decides to prepare to fight, which makes Melty mention that it will endanger all the inhabitants of the area. To which Naofumi responds by telling him that he plans to take the tyrant out of the city. And at that moment Melty notices that Philo and the tyrant's stomach are glowing. So there she tells him that it is possible that the tyrant is following Philo, which would allow them to take the tyrant out of the city using Philo as bait. And there Naofumi realizes that he still has to take care of the semi-human children. But in that Van asks him not to worry, since he will be in charge of fleeing with the children, which causes Raphtalia to be sad at having to separate from Keel again. But then Keel tells her that she is now the companion of the Shield heroes, so she must be with him. And there Keel tells him that he will be fine with Van, so Raphtalia agrees to go with Naofumi, but before leaving, she gives Keel the bracelet that Naofumi gave her, so that he can be protected. And after this, Naofumi, Raphtalia, and Melty get on Philo, and their Philo begins to lure the tyrant out of the city, and along the way, Raphtalia apologizes to Naofumi for having given up his bracelet. To which Naofumi responds by telling him that that bracelet is his, so she can do whatever she wants with him. And after this, we see how Philo manages to leave the city and reach a forest, which begins to cross at high speed, and upon leaving the forest, the boys arrive at a huge lake. So the boys decide to face the tyrant in that place, and there Naofumi uses his air shield to stop him. However, the tyrant destroys it with great ease, which makes Naofumi amazed. And on the other hand, Philo and Raphtalia try to hurt the tyrant, but in that he manages to resist all their attacks easily, which puts kids at a disadvantage. So Naofumi decides to use the anger shield. However, a mysterious voice appears asking him not to use that shield, since it should not depend on that power. And at that moment we see how several Philolial appear, and there they surround the boys and the tyrant. And after this, we see how the queen of the Philolials called Fitoria appears from the lake, which asks the boys to step back since she will take care of the tyrant. And in that we see how the tyrant tries to attack Fitoria, however, she stops him without any problem, and there the tyrant tries to kill her using his fire breath. But in that Fitoria stops him easily, and after this, she kills the tyrant with a single blow, which makes all the boys completely amazed. And after this, Fitoria decides to officially introduce herself to the boys, so in that she shows them her human form, and there Fitoria tells Naofumi that she senses something sinister coming from his shield. And then he mentions that the price for using the cursed powers is very high, so she tells Naofumi that he shouldn't use them, since one day you won't be able to control them. However, Naofumi tells him that he needs the anger shield to survive, so Fitoria decides to end the conversation there. And after this, she invites the boys to the Philolial area through her carriage, with which he quickly teleports them to the holy land of the Philolial. And there he tells the boys that they should rest a little, so they start preparing dinner. And after this, Fitoria decides to talk alone with Naofumi, to which he accepts, and there she asks him to explain how he ended up fighting the tyrant. To which Naofumi tells him that he thought he helped them because he already knew. But then Fitoria mentions that she only went to see the candidate for queen, which turns out to be Philo, and there Naofumi decides to tell everything to Fitoria. And after hearing this, Fitoria gets angry, since she can't believe that the four heroes are fighting. And then, Fitoria asks him why they don't participate in the rest of the world's waves, which makes Naofumi surprised, since he only believed that the waves occurred in the Melramark kingdom. But in that Fitoria mentions that before each kingdom summoned a hero to deal with the waves. However, in Melramark they decided to summon the four, and there Fitoria reveals that she was raised hundreds of years ago by a hero, who asked him to prevent the heroes of the future from fighting among themselves. And after this, he told her that if they got into a fight, she had to kill them in order to summon new heroes with the correct values. So Fitoria asks Naofumi to reconcile with the other heroes, because if they don't fight together, the world could come to an end. And in that she tells him that she won't be able to fight for the world alone. To which Naofumi responds by telling her that she is stronger than all the heroes. But Fitoria tells him that one day his power will not be enough. And then, Fitoria again insists that he reconcile with the heroes, to which Naofumi refuses, since he considers that it was them and the kingdom who rejected him. And then the next day, we see how the boys start to eat, but at that moment Fitoria interrupts breakfast, and there she locks Melty in a wind prison to hold her hostage. And then Fitoria asks Naofumi to promise that he will reconcile with the other heroes, to which Naofumi responds by telling him that he cannot do it. So she tells him that in that case he will have to summon new heroes, since that is the best for the world. And there Naofumi tells him that if he wants to kill him, then he accepts it. But in that he also tells him that he will fight to survive. However, Fitoria decides to use an ability that nullifies the shield's powers, and there she asks them to show her that their group can stop the waves alone. so Fitoria mentions that Philo will fight her in a 1 versus 1, to which Philo accepts. So Fitoria creates a field so that no one intervenes in the fight, and in that we see how Philo equips himself with some strength gloves that Erhard gave him. In order to face Fitoria, however, Fitoria reveals that he is much more superior to her. So seeing that Philo cannot win, Naofumi tries to free Melty, but in that Fitoria uses magic that seriously injures Naofumi, which prevents him from trying to get Melty out of the wind prison. And after this, Fitoria begins to gather magical power from the air to kill Philo, so their Naofumi encourages Philo not to give up, which makes Philo decide to gather magic and attack Fitoria with all his strength. And in that, Philo manages to break through Fitoria's defense and cause her a small scratch. So Fitoria decides to end the duel. And there she reveals that all this was a test for Philo, which he managed to overcome, so Fitoria gives Philo a crown with which she recognizes her as her successor. And in that, the crown becomes a lock. And there Fitoria tells him that as he grows, more locks will also grow. And after this, Fitoria uses one of her locks on Naofumi's shield, which allows you to unlock new abilities. And then at night, Fitoria decides to talk to Naofumi again, to whom he asks if he ever tried to prove his innocence, to which Naofumi responds by saying no. So there Naofumi decides to agree with Fitoria, and after this, Naofumi mentions that he will do what he can to reconcile with the heroes, and after a while, Fitoria decides to use her magic on Naofumi's armor, which causes your stats to increase. And there she tells him that her magic will stop part of the corruption of the cursed shield. But still Fitoria asks him to avoid using it, for which Naofumi thanks him, which causes Fitoria to see the hero who raised her and Naofumi for a moment. And after this, Fitoria teleports the boys near Melremark so that Naofumi can solve his problems with the other heroes, and in that Fitoria asks Naofumi to take care of Philo, to which he accepts. So after this, the boys begin their journey back to Melremark, and after a while, they reach the border, and there Naofumi decides to go to the entrance to try to talk to Ren or Itsuki. But once at the entrance, the boys meet Matoya, which makes Naofumi think that he has had bad luck. But still Naofumi tries to talk to Matoya so that he can understand everything that is happening. However, Naofumi notices that Matoya is very upset, and there he begins to attack Naofumi with fury, which causes Naofumi not to understand what is happening to him. And in that, Matoya reveals that Itsuki and Ren were supposedly murdered by him, this being the reason why Matoya wants to take revenge by killing Naofumi. And there Naofumi tries to make him see reason, but Main intervenes and convinces Matoya that Naofumi is the enemy. And then, she creates a lightning cage where Naofumi's group and Matoya's group are locked up, so at that moment both groups start fighting, and during the fight, we see how Matoya uses the magic of her companions in order to create a new combined ability that he uses to attack Naofumi, which manages to cause a scratch to Naofumi despite using his shield. But in that, Naofumi notes how he can also use a combined technique with Raphtalia, so he asks Raphtalia to activate her magic, which allows them to create a technique called a concealment shield, with which Naofumi manages to absorb Matoya's skill points. And after this, we see how Philo uses his agility to send him flying with a single kick, and then she combines her magic power with Melty's, which allows them to create combined magic with which they take down Matoya's entire group. So Matoya is amazed to witness the strength of Naofumi's group. And after this, Naofumi tries to convince Matoya again, but at that moment Philo feels that something bad is about to happen. So she asks Naofumi to use the maximum power of his shield to protect them all, to which Naofumi accepts, and then we see how a huge ray of magic falls on them. However, the boys manage to survive thanks to Naofumi, and after this we see that the cause of this attack was the Archbishop, and there he reveals that he plans to take down royalty and heroes, since these have only brought problems for the kingdom, this being the reason why he decided to kill Ren and Itsuki. So Matoya realizes that Naofumi is innocent. And after this, the Archbishop reveals that he has a legendary imitation which is capable of taking the form of the hero's legendary weapons. However, this requires a large amount of magic power to use, this being the reason why he has decided to use the believers of the church in order to use their magic, and upon witnessing this, Matoya tries to attack him using a skill from his spear. However, the Archbishop stops him very easily with his magical barrier, so Matoya decides to use her combined technique with her teammates. But in that, the Archbishop reveals that he has not received any damage since all the believers are using their magic until they fall unconscious, so Naofumi begins to wonder what he should do. But at that moment we see how the Archbishop receives a surprise attack which manages to cause damage, and in that it is revealed to us that this attack was caused by Ren and Itsuki, who reveal to the boys that they are still alive. And there Itsuki mentions that they began to investigate the church, since they thought I was hiding something, which caused them to be taken into a trap. However, they were saved in time by Shadow. And after telling this, Ren and Itsuki attack the Archbishop fighting together, which allows them to break his defense again and leave his weapon without magic. And then they tell him that the queen is on her way with her elite soldiers. And upon hearing this, believers begin to doubt, so their Itsuki asks the Archbishop to surrender right now. However, the Archbishop refuses to do so, and there he convinces the believers to continue having faith, so they continue giving their magic to the Archbishop, and upon seeing this, the heroes decide to fight together to stop him. However, Naofumi begins to create a strategy with the girls, since he does not want to fight alongside the three heroes, and there he begins to blame them for having been irresponsible heroes, since these caused great problems in the kingdom, this being the reason why the Archbishop is partly right. So there the boys begin to reflect on their actions, but in that we see how the Archbishop uses the power of his weapon to attack them, so Naofumi uses his shield to defend them all. And after this, he tells the heroes that they are equal to the Archbishop, since everyone gets carried away by their own ego, but in that Naofumi mentions that he made a promise to Futoria, so there he decides to fight alongside them to defeat the Archbishop. And at that moment the Archbishop uses a technique called Cathedral, with which he creates a space where his strength and defense increase considerably. And then Ren and Itsuki attack the Archbishop with all their strength. However, it nullifies his techniques easily, so Philo and Raphtalia decide to join the fight. And there they manage to hurt the Archbishop. However, he manages to recover quickly thanks to the believers, so this time Naofumi decides to make a combined attack with Matoya, which allows Naofumi to use a fire technique against the Archbishop, but at that the Archbishop stops his attack with great ease, since Naofumi's cursed attacks are weaker inside the cathedral. And after this, we see how several believers begin to die after giving up all their magic, which makes the boys surprised to see how dangerous the Archbishop is. But then Naofumi notices that he has unlocked a new cursed ability, so he decides to use her to defeat the Archbishop, which makes the girls worry about Naofumi, but then he tells them that nothing happened to him last time. So there he mentions that this time he will also have control, and after this, Naofumi activates the cursed shield, and in that we see how he tries to resist the dragon's wrath. However, he mentions that the anger he feels is also his. So in that Naofumi begins to remember the bad moments he has experienced, which causes it to begin to be consumed by hate. But at that moment Naofumi hears the girls' voices, and there he begins to remember his adventures with them, which causes Naofumi to regain consciousness. And in that we see how the girls are hugging Naofumi, which caused burns due to the anger shield. So Naofumi apologizes to them, and there he thanks them, and then Naofumi asks the other heroes for help to defeat the Archbishop, which makes them surprised, but in that they decide to work together, so everyone there begins to destroy the Archbishop's defenses more easily, which causes the Archbishop to begin to weaken. So he uses a special technique to kill all the heroes, but at that moment we see how the Queen intervenes in the fight. And there he uses his ice magic to stop the Archbishop, which allows Naofumi to use his new technique called Blood Sacrifice. And in that we see how Naofumi loses a lot of blood to activate his technique, which devours the Archbishop in an instant, thus ending the conflict. However, Naofumi falls unconscious after using the Blood Sacrifice. So the girls start to worry when they see Naofumi in that state. But at that moment we see how the Queen appears in front of them, and there she mentions that she will not let the shield hero die. And after 3 days, we see how Naofumi wakes up in Melremark Castle, so the girls are happy to witness this, and then we see how the Queen enters the room. And there she appears before Naofumi as Myrlia, and after this, Myrlia decides to talk to Naofumi to tell him everything. So there she reveals that she was not in Melremark because she went to a world meeting in which they decided how to face the waves of destruction. And there she mentions that it was agreed that each of the great kingdoms would summon a hero. However, Alt went ahead and summoned all 4 in Melremark, this being the reason why Myrlia had to go to calm the other kings. And there Naofumi mentions that in another kingdom perhaps he would not have been hated. To which Myrlia responds, confirming what she says, since in the Siltvelt kingdom, the shield hero is worshipped as a god, and there Myrlia mentions that Alt hates the shield heroes for this reason, since they protect a race that killed several of their relatives in the past. And after telling this, Myrlia tells Naofumi that she will be in charge of clearing his name, since Melremark cannot survive without the shield hero. However, Naofumi tells him that he does not plan to stay in this kingdom, and then he mentions that he will go where the waves appear and leave when they end, since that way Naofumi will be able to return to his world more quickly. So there Myrlia understands Naofumi's decision. And after this talk, we see how Myrlia begins the trial of Alt and Main, which he decides to transmit to the entire kingdom. And there Myrlia uses a slave seal so that they are not able to lie. So after this, the villagers find out that Main deceived everyone so that they would think that Naofumi was a criminal. And on the other hand, Alt helped Naofumi's situation worsen. So after this trial, Naofumi manages to prove his innocence before the entire kingdom. And after this, Alt and Main are sentenced to death. So after the trial, we see how these are taken to the guillotine and their Main asks Matoya to save her. However, Matoya refuses to do so after being tricked by her, which makes Main shocked. But at that moment we see how Naofumi decides to stop the execution, and there he himself decides to let Alt and Main live with one condition, which consists of now Alt being called trash and Main being called bitch, to which Myrlia gladly accepts, since she also did not want to execute her husband and daughter. And after this, Naofumi tells Myrlia that he will collaborate with Melremark. However, this will also help the other kingdoms since he considers himself a hero who saves the world from the waves. And after a while, we see how the boys visit the Melremark church, where you notice that now it also worships the hero of the shield. So Naofumi decides to go up class with the girls using the hourglass. And after this, the boys meet with Myrlia, to whom they say that they did not have the option to choose a class, and there Myrlia mentions that this can happen sometimes since certain equipped items force a class upgrade to a specific one. And after this explanation, Myrlia mentions that a banquet will be held tonight. So Naofumi decides to reject the invitation. However, Myrlia tells him that the banquet is actually a facade, since she wants to have a secret meeting with the 4 heroes. So later at night, we see how the girls attend the banquet. And meanwhile, Myrlia meets with the 4 heroes alone, and in that we see how an ally of Itsuki begins to insult Raphtalia for being semi-human. And then, he starts insulting Naofumi in front of her, which causes Raphtalia to get angry and start a scandal at the banquet. And on the other hand, Myrlia talks to the boys about an island called Calmira, which has become an area where the experience obtained increases. So she recommends that the boys go to that island since because of Main, the heroes have not been able to level up correctly, and there Myrlia mentions that this is a good opportunity for everyone to get along, so they could share information with each other. However, the 3 heroes decide to refuse to collaborate, since they consider it a waste of time. But then Myrlia tells them that if they continue with that attitude, they will all die in the next wave, since Naofumi is currently the only one capable of surviving with his strength. So upon hearing this, the heroes decide to share information, which allows Naofumi to learn several useful things, one of them being an ability to teleport to a registered location. But after talking for a while, the boys argue among themselves again, which makes Naofumi decide to withdraw from the meeting. And after this, Naofumi meets with Raphtalia, who reveals that he also caused a fight during the feast. But after this, Naofumi decides to continue keeping the promise he made to Fitoria, so he decides to trust the information that the heroes gave him. And then the next day, the boys start traveling to go to the port of Melremark, but along the way, they decide to stop in the town of Raphtalia, where Rafana's remains are buried. And after this, we see how the boys arrive at the port, where they meet up with the other heroes to travel to Calmira Island. And once inside the ship, Naofumi meets 2 adventurers named Lark and Teresa, who do not believe that Naofumi is the hero of the shield, since they think that the shield hero is a cruel villain. So Lark treats Naofumi kindly, believing that he is not the hero he hates. And after this, Teresa finds out that Naofumi is a good jeweler, so she tasks him with preparing an accessory using high-quality material, to which Naofumi accepts. So Teresa is happy to hear this. And after a few hours of travel, we see how the boys arrive at Calmira, where they are received by the island's manager named Havenberg, who is forced to talk only with Naofumi since the other heroes are dizzy from having traveled by boat. And there he gives you the instructions and rules of the island. And after this, Naofumi's group meets again with Lark and Tears, which propose to Naofumi to form an alliance to level up faster. And seeing that these seem to be strong adventurers, Naofumi decides to accept. So Lark tells Naofumi that tomorrow they will meet to fight together. And after a few hours, the boys decide to hunt monsters, and there they realize that even the weakest monsters grant a lot of experience, so they decide to take advantage of this situation. But after a while, we see how they meet the groups of the other heroes, which begin to fight for the area in which they are leveling up. So, upon witnessing this, Naofumi decides to go to another desolate place, where he begins to fight various monsters with Raphtalia and Philo, and there Naofumi creates some weapons made of a monster for the girls, since their ancient weapons have been worn out from fighting so much. And then at night we see how the boys have obtained quality objects, so there he realizes that it is better for them to fight at night. And in that we see how Lark and Teresa appear in front of the boys, since they were worried because they had not yet returned. So at that point they decide to return to the town with Lark and Teresa. And there we see how everyone begins to drink and celebrate together. And then the next day, Naofumi gives the accessory he created to Teresa, so she is happy and pays him a large sum of money. which makes Naofumi amazed, and after this, the boys decide to level up with Lark and Teresa, and their Naofumi realizes that they are very strong, so these manage to climb many levels together. And after this, Naofumi proposes that they continue moving up the levels as a group. However, Lark tells him that they will fight separately from now on, to which Naofumi accepts, and after this, Naofumi decides to take a day of rest with the girls on the beach, but then Philo tells him that she has found an island under the water. So Naofumi decides to go explore it using special suits. And once there, they enter an ancient temple who owns an hourglass, and in that Naofumi finds out that in 2 days there will be a wave in Calmyra. So he decides to tell Myrlia about this, which decides to prepare for the wave that will appear in the sea, so she sends her best soldiers alongside the heroes on giant ships. And in that Naofumi notices how Lark and Teresa have also appeared to help, so the girls are happy to see them, and after this, we see how the wave is about to begin, so everyone is transported to the battlefield where various sea creatures begin to appear, so all the soldiers throw several liquor bombs which they use to stun monsters, which allows them to hunt them more easily. And in that we see how the head of the wave appears, so there the boys realize that it is an interdimensional whale which proves to be quite strong underwater, so Naofumi decides to enter the sea with Philo, and there he catches the whale's attention with one of his skills, which allows him to make the whale come out of the water, so the other heroes attack the whale with their sacred weapons. However, these fail to cause any damage, and at that moment Raphtalia attacks the whale from a long distance and causes a wound. So Naofumi realizes that Raphtalia now causes more damage than the other heroes. And on the other hand, we see how several monsters invade one of the ships, so Melty uses her magic to expel them, but then she is captured by one of the monsters, which tries to drag her to the bottom of the sea. However, Lark appears and saves her, and after this, he defeats the monsters that invaded the ship in one fell swoop, which makes everyone amazed to witness his strength. And there he decides to work with Naofumi to defeat the whale. So in that, Naofumi once again draws the attention of the whale underwater, which allows you to bring it to the surface. And there Lark seriously injures the whale, so Philo attacks her to keep her out of the water, which allows Lark to do a combined technique with Teresa in order to kill the whale with a single attack. And after this, the three heroes approach the whale's corpse to collect the loot. However, Lark sends them flying with a single attack, so Naofumi asks Lark for an explanation. And there he reveals that he and Teresa are heroes just like Naofumi. However, these belong to another world which is also attacked by the waves. And then, Lark tells him that if he kills the heroes of his world can be saved. So there Naofumi learns the true purpose of the waves. And in that, Lark decides to kill Naofumi, so at that moment we see how Naofumi's group begins to fight against Lark and Teresa. But after a while, we see how Glass enters the battlefield. And there it is revealed to us that Lark and Teresa are allies of Glass, so Glass begins to help them in order to kill Naofumi. And in that she combines her powers with Teresa, which uses the accessory that Naofumi gave her to increase her magical powers. So Naofumi protects the girls from the attack of the other heroes with his abilities. And after this, Naofumi notices that Glass is afraid of his concealment shield, so at that point he decides to fight Glass alone. And there Naofumi asks the girls to take care of Lark and Teresa, what they accept. So Naofumi takes Glass to an empty ship, and there he asks her if she is also a hero of her world, to which she responds by telling him that she is the heroine of the fans. And after revealing this, Glass begins to attack Naofumi. But in that, Naofumi uses the concealment shield, which causes great damage to Glass. So there he asks her to leave so that the wave ends. However, Glass tells him that the battle will not end until one of them dies. So she tries to attack Naofumi, which is defended using the concealment shield again, so he asks her to stop, because if she continues fighting, she will die. But then Lark gives Glass a potion to regain his strength, which allows him to attack Naofumi despite using the concealment shield. So Naofumi decides to use the cursed shield, but then a member of Itsuki's group named Rishia intervenes in the fight. And there she sends barrels of liquor over Glass, which Naofumi uses so that Glass is affected by the effects of liquor. So there Lark and Teresa decide to retire with Glass since the extra time of the wave is over, so they return to their world, thus ending the conflict. And after this, Naofumi decides to rest for a few days in Calmyra, where he meets Rishia again, which was expelled from Itsuki's group for a mistake she did not make. And upon understanding his situation, Naofumi decides to ask him to join his group, to which Rishia accepts with great joy. And after this, we see how Naofumi meets with Myrlia, which asks him what reward he wants for having saved them all, to which he responds by saying that he wants to become the governor of the town of Raphtalia, which allows him to rebuild it with the help of its inhabitants and several of his friends. So Raphtalia thanks you for all this, and there Naofumi tells him that the story of the hero of the shield begins from now on. And after this, we see how the Raftalia village called Lorelona begins to prosper, which allows Naofumi to recruit new allies for the town. So Naofumi is happy to witness this. And on the other hand, we see how the old woman is training Rishia and Keel so that they can master a special energy called Kai. And during training, the old woman realizes that Rishia has great potential. So Rishia is happy to hear this, and in that we see how Naofumi appears and interrupts the training, and there he tells Rishia that he can't always depend on the costume he's wearing. To which Rishia responds by telling her that the costume gives her more confidence, since then no one can see if she is sad and it allows her to try even harder. And after this, it is revealed to us that there is 1 week left until the next wave appears, so there Keel asks the old woman if he can fight when that day comes. To which the old woman responds by saying no, since he is not strong enough yet, so Keel asks him to train him to prepare for future waves, which makes the old woman happy to see that Keel has not lost heart. But then we see how the conversation is interrupted by bat-shaped monsters, which begin to attack all of Lorelona. So at that point Raftalia and Philo begin to fight against the invaders, to protect the villagers, and there they manage to kill all the monsters with great ease. And after this, Naofumi decides to absorb one of the bats, and as he does so, he realizes that these are familiars of a monster, which are creatures that were created by a stronger monster, so there Raftalia wonders if these are monsters from a wave, to which Naofumi responds by telling him that it is not possible because the wave has not yet started. And at that moment he realizes that the wave countdown has stopped. And after this, the boys feel the presence of a monster in the distance, which makes Naofumi wonder what is happening. And after this, we see how the heroes are reunited by Myrlia, where they discover that the bats have attacked the entire kingdom of Melramark. However, no hero yet knows where they come from. And in that, Myrlia reveals to them that a legendary turtle spirit has awakened, which has caused his relatives to attack everyone. So she asks the boys to work together to stop the turtle. However, they decide to reject Myrlia's request. So at that point all the heroes, except for Naofumi, leave the meeting. And once outside, we see how Itsuki meets Rishia, who do you decide to greet? And after this, Itsuki leaves with his group. But then Rishia stops him and asks if she can be his partner again. To which Itsuki responds by saying no, since he considers that Rishia is of no use to him in his current state. And there Rishia tries to insist with her request, but then she is stopped by one of Itsuki's allies, which tells her that she is too weak and clumsy to be in his group. So upon hearing this, Rishia starts to cry, so the girls come to her to comfort her. And on the other hand, Naofumi continues talking with Myrlia, which mentions that the turtle has already destroyed several areas of the east, and if it continues to advance, it will also destroy Naofumi's village. So there Naofumi decides to accept defeating the turtle spirit, for which Myrlia thanks him. And after this, Naofumi's group visits Erhard in order to improve his equipment. And there Raftalia recommends Rishia to use a sword. However, Rishia tells him that she prefers not to use it, since she thinks that she is bad at fighting with any type of weapon. And in that we see how Raftalia comes up with a new idea for Rishia to become stronger. So she takes Rishia to Balaka's so that the slave seal is placed, since this will allow you to improve faster by being under the protection of Naofumi. And at that moment, Naofumi asks Raftalia to stop, since he will not force anyone else to become his slave, so Raftalia apologizes to Rishia. But then Rishia decides to become Naofumi's slave, since she wants to get stronger. So in that we see how Balaka's begins the ritual of the slave seal. And after this, Rishia becomes a slave to Naofumi. So Naofumi asks Rishia if she cares that much about being accepted by Itsuki, to which she responds by saying yes, since that is why she decided to train with Naofumi. So Naofumi decides to help Rishia. And after this, he asks the girls to get ready, since they will soon travel east to kill the turtle spirit. And then the next day, we watch as the boys begin their journey east. So along the way, they meet new towns, and after several days, they reach the realm closest to the turtle spirit, where they hear that several kingdoms have united to kill the creature. And then the boys hear that the 3 heroes died trying to kill the turtle, which causes Rishia to get upset. So there she decides to move forward on her own to see if Itsuki is okay. But at that point Naofumi decides to stop her along with the other girls to calm her down. And there Naofumi asks Philo to communicate with Vittoria through her locks, to ask if the heroes are really dead, and in doing so, Vittoria reveals to them that they are still alive. So there Naofumi asks Rishia to calm down. And after this, he decides to get information within the town, but at that moment we see how more familiars of the turtle spirit appear, which begin to attack the villagers. So the boys decide to fight the monsters to protect them all, but seeing that there are many of them, Naofumi decides to attract them all with his ability. And there he uses a new technique called Tornado Shield, with which you defeat several enemies at the same time. However, Naofumi notices how more monsters appear, so there he decides to use the anger shield, which allows him to kill everyone with a single attack, but in that we see how Naofumi is quite tired. So the girls decide to go help him, and at that moment we see how a mysterious woman named Ost appears in front of them. And there she recognizes Naofumi as the hero of the shield, so Ost asks Naofumi to kill her, which makes Naofumi confused. But at that moment we see how the presence of the turtle appears again, and after this, the boys notice that Ost has disappeared. And after a few hours, Naofumi attends a meeting organized by several generals who represent different kingdoms of the world, and then they begin to argue about how they should confront the turtle. And there it is revealed to us that this is in charge of attacking areas with high populations, so the kings are able to deduce which city will be their next objective. And in that, Naofumi asks the generals how they will defeat the turtle, since they have no time to waste, so he mentions that they should create a plan soon. And in that we see how the generals get angry with Naofumi since they consider that their armies will be enough to kill the turtle. But then one of the generals mentions that they need the 4 heroes since tens of thousands of his soldiers tried to kill the turtle before, however, they failed to do so. So Naofumi decides to collaborate with the allied army to stop this threat. And after this, we see how one of the generals proposes calling the 7 astral heroes. However, another general mentions that they will not be able to come to help them, since most of them are very far from this area, and in that Naofumi asks them who the 7 astral heroes are. And there Myrlia tells him that there are 7 heroes who use weapons known as vassal weapons, who fight to protect the world from the waves. However, these are weaker than the 4 legendary heroes, and upon hearing this, Naofumi begins to wonder where the astral heroes are now. But at that moment we see how Ost interrupts the meeting of the allied army, and there she reveals to them that she is actually a familiar of the turtle spirit, which makes everyone surprised to hear this. And there Ost mentions that his job is to gather the minimum number of souls necessary for the turtle. And not understanding anything, Naofumi asks for a more detailed explanation. And then Ost tells him that the turtle uses human souls as energy in order to prevent waves from occurring. So Ost caused wars between 2 sides to gather the necessary souls, and if this doesn't work, the turtle sends his monster familiars for these to gather souls directly around the world, and if that doesn't work either, that's when the turtle wakes up in order to gather souls on their own, devastating the world. However, this time the turtle spirit has been awakened by an unknown who is manipulating her so that she destroys everything in her path. So there Ost tells them that for that reason she must stop the turtle, and in that she mentions that to defeat her, they must cut her throat. And after this, the generals begin to wonder who should take command, which causes a big argument between them, since each one wishes to take command of the operation for their honor. So upon hearing this discussion, Naofumi gets angry with everyone. And there he mentions that it doesn't matter who is in charge, since the important thing is to create a plan that does not cause so many victims. And after mentioning this, Naofumi decides to leave the meeting. And after a few hours, Raphtalia meets with the girls, and there we see how the old woman and a Melremark soldier named Eclair meet there, since both are currently working for Naofumi and for Lorelona. So Raphtalia brings the girls up to date on what happened at the meeting. And after this, we see how Ost appears to talk to them, and during this talk, it is revealed to us that Eclair is in charge of training soldiers so that they can be ready to defend Lorelona. So Raphtalia has improved with the use of the sword thanks to Eclair. And after this conversation, we see how Raphtalia meets with Naofumi, whom he convinces to work alongside the generals of the other kingdoms, since deep down they only want to protect their towns. And there Naofumi decides to accept Raphtalia's advice. So the next day, Naofumi works with the generals in order to create a good strategy and be able to stop the turtle spirit. And after this, we see how the allied army gathers all its soldiers, since this way they will be able to attract the turtle when there are many people gathered together, which will allow them to stop the turtle spirit. So with that, everyone begins to prepare so that the plan is a success. And then at night, we see how the boys decide to rest. And there Eclair mentions that before meeting them, she passed through the capital, so she met Erhard, which decided to send several gifts to the girls. So in that, Raphtalia receives a new sword, Philo a claw, and Rishia a new costume, so all 3 manage to increase their statistics. And after this, Ost asks Rishia if she is with Naofumi to help Itsuki, to which she responds stating it with a lot of guilt. And upon noticing this, Naofumi tells her that it was he who encouraged her to do it. So there he asks her not to be so hard on herself. And then Ost realizes that Rishia likes Itsuki, which causes Rishia to get nervous. So that's when Ost decides to give Rishia love advice, so that she can conquer Itsuki. But then the conversation is interrupted by the presence of the turtle, so everyone realizes that it is close to them. So the next day, the generals decide to meet again, where they receive news that the turtle is approaching them, but there a soldier informs them that Naofumi has already begun to move with the army. And on the other hand, we see how Naofumi is about to leave to fight the turtle, but at that point he is stopped by an escort from Myrlia, which turns out to be Shadow, who mentions that Myrlia sent her to help him. So Naofumi accepts her into the army, and after this, Eclair tells Naofumi that they are ready to leave. And there he asks her not to die, so she asks him the same thing. And after this, Eclair begins to advance with the army towards the turtle, and in that we see how Naofumi also advances with the girls, which causes the morale of all soldiers to rise. And at that moment we see how the familiars of the turtle spirit appear, so Naofumi decides to attract them all so that the army can reach the turtle without problems. So at that point he separates from the army along with the girls. And after this, Naofumi activates his ability to attract the attention of family members, which causes them to begin to follow Naofumi and ignore the army. So that's when the army manages to reach the turtle, which they begin to attract towards a large crack since they plan to guide her into a trap. And on the other hand, Naofumi realizes that the plan is working, so there the boys decide to stop, and then they decide to eliminate all of the turtle's relatives, which causes Rishia to get nervous. But in that we see how Ost decides to use his gravity magic, with which he manages to take down most of the family members, so the boys decide to take advantage of this opportunity, so these begin to defeat the remaining enemies. And in that we see how Shadow appears before Naofumi, to whom he informs that the soldier's trap has not worked, so the turtle spirit hasn't stopped. And on the other hand, the soldiers begin to shoot several projectiles at the turtle in order to prevent it from continuing to advance. However, the turtle takes out half of the assault squad with ease. So their general decides to blow up the fort near the turtle, which causes the turtle to stop. So the remaining soldiers manage to approach the turtle without problems. But at that moment Ost begins to remember new information about the turtle. So there it is mentioning that the turtle is capable of attacking from a long distance, and in that we see how it begins to end with several soldiers shooting magical spikes, so Naofumi is upset when he witnesses this. But at that moment he decides to try to cut the turtle's neck. So there he tells the girls that they should advance towards her. But before leaving, Naofumi asks Shadow to send a message to Myrlia, and after this, Naofumi begins to advance with the girls, so there Eclair decides to follow him with his remaining soldiers. And on the other hand, we see how Myrlia receives the message from Naofumi, which asks him to gather all the wizards of Melremark so that they can use collective magic against the turtle's neck. So Myrlia decides to accept Naofumi's request. And back with Naofumi, he asks Ost if she is sure what she is about to do, because if they kill the turtle, she will die too. To which Ost responds by telling him that he doesn't care. So Naofumi decides to continue advancing, but then they are stopped by a rather powerful familiar of the turtle. And there Ost decides to stop him using his gravity magic. And then army soldiers show up to help Ost stop the familiar, so that Naofumi can continue advancing. So Naofumi decides to move forward with the girls. And in that we see how the family member tries to kill the soldiers, however, Ost protects them all using his magic. So Naofumi decides not to worry about them and continue moving forward. And at that moment we see how the magicians cast a powerful lightning bolt on the turtle, which causes a wound in the neck. And there the old woman tells Naofumi that they should not waste this opportunity. So Naofumi orders Raphtalia and Philo to attack the turtle's wound, which he accepts, and in that they both attack the turtle with all their strength, which makes it try to escape. However, Naofumi uses his air shield to stop her. And at that moment we see how Ost appears behind Naofumi, and there she uses her magic to reinforce the legendary shield, which allows Naofumi to increase the power of his air shield. And on the other hand, Rishia uses her magic to increase Raphtalia and Philo's strength. So there they both attack the turtle again, which allows them to decapitate her. So upon witnessing this, all the soldiers begin to celebrate. And then we see how the boys are sad to know that Ost has died too. So there Rishia starts crying for her. But at that moment we see how Ost gives him a handkerchief to dry his tears. And there they realize that Ost is still alive. So in that she reveals to them that the turtle spirit has not yet been defeated. And after this, we see how the boys return to camp, and there Rishia decides to tell her story to the girls. So in that we move to the past, where it is revealed to us that Rishia comes from an impoverished noble family. And there we see how Rishia lives completely happy with her parents, but one day we see how some guys enter Rishia's house in order to take her as a slave, since his family was the target of some nobles from his neighboring town. So at that Rishia begins to spend his days inside a cell. But one day, we see how Itsuki appears to save her, since he managed to expose the crimes of the nobles. And back in the present, Rishia tells everyone that that's why she appreciates Itsuki so much. And then she mentions that for that reason she wants to return the favor and be of use to him. And upon hearing this story, Ost tells Rishia that Itsuki is surely fine. So Rishia thanks him for his words, and after this, we see how Naofumi meets with the girls since he was in a meeting with the generals, so Raphtalia asks if they have already decided what to do with the turtle. To which Naofumi responds by saying yes, since tomorrow they will go on the back of the turtle spirit to explore it. And then the next day, the boys leave the camp to go to the turtle, and along the way, Naofumi mentions that they must kill the turtle quickly, because if it manages to recover, then it will put more lives at risk. And then, Naofumi mentions that on the turtle's back, Os could recover his memory, which is good for everyone because then they will be able to find the turtle's weakness. And after a while, we see how the boys arrive at the place where the monster is. So these climb on the turtle's back, which they begin to explore because it is quite large, and along the way, Rishia asks Ost if he has managed to remember anything new. To which she responds by saying no, because feel like your mind is clouded. And there Rishia realizes that everything around her is covered in fog. So she notices that the environment on Torture's back is linked to Ost's mind. And after this, Naofumi tells the girls that they will camp there at night, which makes everyone surprised, but still they decide to follow Naofumi. And later at night, Rishia notices how Raphtalia and Philo are very close, which makes them look like sisters, so Rishia begins to feel a little jealous of being an only child. And there Ost asks Rishia if she doesn't miss her parents, to which she responds by saying yes. However, Rishia decided to separate from them to help them from afar. And upon mentioning this, Rishia remembers how she was kicked out of Itsuki's group, which makes her sad, but then Ost tells him that she can help him by being an ally of Naofumi. So now Rishia can be useful to Itsuki. And upon hearing this, Rishia begins to cry with joy. So she thanks Ost for his words, and then Ost begins to recover part of his memories, which causes the fog in the area to disappear. And after this, Ost mentions that they already know where they have to go. So in that we see how the boys decide to follow Ost. And after walking for a while, they discover a town on the turtle's back, which has several corpses inside it. So the next day, we see how Myrlia arrives at the town with several soldiers in order to collect the corpses, and after this, the boys enter a temple that is in the town which is in poor condition, but still the boys decide to explore it, and there the girls find an unknown writing that comes from another world. But then Naofumi realizes that the writing is in Japanese, so Myrlia deduces that the writing was made by ancient heroes. And in that Ost mentions that the writing talks about the seal of the turtle and how to break it, and there she reveals that she knows because she has been starting to remember more things. But before he can say anything else, we see how the temple begins to collapse. So the boys are forced to retreat, which causes Naofumi to become frustrated. But then Ost remembers that to defeat the turtle you have to destroy its heart, which can be reached through a secret entrance. So there Naofumi decides to enter, and at that he asks the old woman, Myrlia, Eclair and Rishia to return to the camp, but upon hearing this, Rishia tells Naofumi that she will go with him. So upon noticing her determination, Naofumi decides to accept her. And after this, the boys enter the turtle's body through the secret entrance, where we see how Rishia is scared, but in that Ost thanks him for having decided to go with them, which makes Rishia calm down a little. And then Naofumi notices that there are people inside the turtle's body, so this one gets on guard. And at that moment we see how an adventurer appears and attacks him. However, Naofumi manages to stop his attack easily. And then Raphtalia decides to illuminate the area with her magic of light. So Naofumi realizes that they are 3 ordinary adventurers, which were supposedly sent by Myrlia to explore the area. But upon seeing Naofumi, they decide to retire and leave the rest to him. However, Naofumi stops them, and there he orders Raphtalia to use her anti-concealment magic, which makes the 3 adventurers show their true appearances, and in that it is revealed to us that these are actually Lark, Teresa and Glass. So Naofumi begins to wonder what they are doing there. And their Lark asks Naofumi not to worry about them since they don't plan to fight him. And then Lark reveals that they have come to finish off the one who broke the turtle's seal, since this person comes from the same world as Lark, Teresa and Glass, and in that Glass mentions that the person who broke the seal wants to gain power, this being the reason why he is using the guardian beasts from other worlds. And their Lark mentions that this guy does what he wants for his own benefit, so his actions will also bring destruction to his world. And after this, Lark proposes to Naofumi to make a truce and collaborate. However, Naofumi immediately rejects his proposal, since he does not want to collaborate with future enemies, and in that Naofumi tells them that they can do whatever they want since he currently does not consider them enemies, so Lark accepts Naofumi's decision. So he decides to move forward alone with Teresa and Glass. And after this, Naofumi continues advancing with the girls, and their Ost begins to remember the path more easily, which makes Philo wonder what path Lark and the others have taken. And after a while, we see how the boys find a blue hourglass which has sand that has already fallen. So there the boys realize that this has no relationship with the waves, and their Ost tells them that that clock symbolizes the number of souls that the turtle has accumulated. And then he mentions that when it is full, a barrier will be created, which will protect the world from the waves. And then Naofumi asks Ost if that watch is the heart they are looking for, to which Ost responds by saying no, since she just wanted to check how much energy the soul turtle has received. And after this, Ost decides to take the boys to the heart of the turtle. And on the other hand, we see how Lark and the others are fleeing from several relatives. So their Lark realizes that they are going on the right path. And after running for a while, they manage to find the turtle's heart. So there they decide to destroy it. And back with Naofumi, we see how he continues to advance with the girls, and there Rishia realizes that Ost is not feeling well, since she feels bad for having sacrificed so many souls for the turtle, which makes her wonder what she should really protect. And at that moment Rishia asks Ost not to carry everything alone since she is currently part of Naofumi's group, and in that we see how Raphtalia tells him she thinks the same as Rishia, so there she gives all her support to Ost. And after this, Naofumi finds a way out of the turtle's interior, so he asks Ost if they should return and take another path, to which Ost tells him that it will not be necessary, and in that she opens a path between one of the walls. And after this, Ost mentions that if they continue on that path, they will reach the heart, so the boys decide to move forward, and after a while, they reach the heart where they are greeted by the person who broke the turtle's seal, which turns out to be the bearer of the vassal book called Kaio. So then Ost attacks him using his magic. However, he reveals that his real body is not there. And after this, Kaio mentions to Naofumi that he has deceived Lark since he is destroying fake hearts in another part of the turtle's interior, this being the reason why the boys did not meet the heroes of the other world. And in that, Naofumi demands that Kaio stop controlling the turtle spirit. However, Kaio immediately rejects his request. And there Kaio tells Naofumi that in his world it is easier to control the guardian beast, since the world where he comes from, it is more difficult to do this, being the reason why Kaio has decided to come to Naofumi's world. And in that, Ost mentions that the fate of this world will be decided by the legendary heroes, so there she tells Kaio that he must return to the turtle spirit. But at that moment we see how the heart's defense system is activated, so this one starts attacking the boys, which means that Naofumi must protect the girls. And after this, Philo attacks the turtle's heart, and then Ost starts to feel pain, which makes the girls worry about her. However, Ost asks them not to stop. So Raphtalia decides to destroy the heart with a single attack, and in that Ost manages to recover all his memories, so she starts crying after this. And in that we see Ost is still alive. So Naofumi realizes that having destroyed the heart was not enough either. But then Ost mentions that he already knows how to destroy the turtle. And in that moment she creates a new path, and there Ost asks the boys to come in there, what they accept. And on the other hand, we see how the turtle's head regenerates, so she begins to threaten all the soldiers present, who decide to wait for Naofumi to destroy the turtle from within. And back with Naofumi, we see how he reaches the core of the turtle, where they are received by the real Kaio. And there it is revealed to us that Ost is actually the turtle spirit, so Kaio mentions that they could have avoided many deaths if they killed her first. And in that we see how the head and heart of the turtle regenerate again, which causes the core to now be protected by a barrier, which can only be destroyed if you destroy the head and the heart at the same time. And then Kaio reveals that he has kidnapped the 3 heroes, which he uses as a source of power, so the boys are surprised to see this. And in a change of scene, we see how the turtle tries to destroy the allied army. However, Fitoria appears to protect them, and there she begins to fight against the turtle to help Naofumi. And on the other hand, we see how Lark, Teresa, and Glass reach the core, so there they decide to fight against Kaio to stop his plans. And then Kaio uses his vassal weapon to attack them all with his powers. So Raphtalia and Philo try to counterattack. However, Kaio manages to defend himself with a special barrier made from the power of the heroes. And after this, Kaio uses a gravity technique with which he knocks down all the boys. But at that moment Rishia stands up thanks to his Kai handling. And there she decides to fight Kaio to save them all, which gives Ost and Naofumi time to use their magic, so that everyone can free themselves from Kaio's gravity power. And after this, Ost creates a path to the turtle's heart so that Lark, Teresa, Glass, and Philo can go destroy it. And on the other hand, Rishia manages to break the prison that imprisoned the 3 heroes, which makes Kaio angry. So there he tries to kill her with powerful magic from his book. However, Rishia stops her with great ease, which makes everyone surprised. And on the other hand, we see how Fitoria manages to destroy the turtle's neck, so at that Philo gives the signal to Glass and Teresa, which use their powers to destroy the heart. And at that moment, Ost activates a power that he left inside Naofumi's shield, which allows Naofumi to use the shield of the turtle spirit with which it destroys the nucleus. So upon witnessing this, Kaio decides to return to his world, and their Lark and the girls decide to go after him to capture him. And on the other hand, Ost uses his power to make Naofumi travel to other worlds. So their Naofumi and the girls decide to say goodbye to Ost, which is glad to have been in Naofumi's group, before dying with the turtle. And after this, Naofumi, Raphtalia, Philo and Rishia travel to the world of Lark and the others. And then we see how Naofumi, Rishia and Raphtalia wake up in a cell, and there they realize that they are now level 1. So Raphtalia is a girl again. And after this, they realize that Philo is not with them, so the boys decide to get out of the prison they are in order to find Philo, and in doing so, they are transported to an island where they decide to level up against weak monsters, since with their current level, they will not be able to face the threats of the new world. And after a few hours, the boys meet a Kappa which has a higher level than them, so their Naofumi tries to protect the girls using his body as a shield. But at that moment the Kappa is defeated by a girl named Kazuna, which reveals to be the heroine of the sacred weapon of the hunt, and there she decides to take the boys to the cells again, in order to treat Naofumi's wounds. And once there, Kazuna reveals that they are in the Infinite Labyrinth, which is a temporary prison from which it is impossible to escape, which makes the boys surprised. And after this, Kazuna reveals to the boys that she is Glass's best friend, so she's glad to hear that you're okay. And then, Kazuna invites the boys to eat. However, Naofumi tells her that he still doesn't trust her, and then Kazuna reveals that she cannot attack any human with her sacred weapon. So there she asks him to trust her because she can't hurt them, to which Naofumi accepts. And then the next day, Kazuna gives the boys a tour of the prison, and there she reveals that she has been locked up there for many years, since Kazuna has not been able to find a way out. And then Kazuna takes the boys to a small bug on the edge of the prison, since that is the furthest place he has been able to reach. And upon seeing this, Naofumi decides to use the bug to his advantage. And there Naofumi creates a bioplant seed with Kazuna, which is used in the bug in order to expand the error zone and create a crack in space which allows everyone to escape the Infinite Labyrinth. So there the boys are sent to the new world, so Kazuna is glad to be able to be in the outside world again, which causes her to hug the boys while thanking them for helping her. And after this, Kazuna suggests that the boys go to the Sickle Kingdom, since there they venerate her as a heroine because they invoked her. However, Naofumi finds out that it will take a long time to get there. So there they decide to go to the capital called Mika, since there they can use the hourglass to teleport to another kingdom, so the boys agree to go to Mika. And once there, they realize that this world is similar to feudal Japan. And then, Kazuna mentions that they must earn money soon since she doesn't have much money, so in that Naofumi decides to sell the products of his world, which he was able to collect thanks to the shield. So the next day, we see how he begins to sell the products on the street, and there they manage to save a lot of money. So after this, Naofumi decides to hold an auction of his products, since this has gained a lot of fame within the capital, and thanks to the auction, the boys manage to earn enough money which allows them to buy good weapons and armor for everyone. And after this, Kazuna buys a travel permit in order not to have problems when passing through the checkpoints, and then the boys start walking around the city, and then they watch as a genius sorcerer named Kazu is praised by the villagers, since he developed a more effective method of teleportation. And in that, Naofumi notices that it is snowing, so he decides to look for a place to stay for now. And once there, they decide to infiltrate the place where they have the hourglass, in order not to endanger Kazuna, since it was the same Mika kingdom that locked her in the Infinite Labyrinth. So with that, the boys infiltrate the castle where the clock is. But once there, Kazuna realizes that the clock is not there, so they fell into a trap, and there the boys begin to fight against several soldiers until they find the clock, which is protected by Kazu, who reveals to be Kaio's partner. And in that, Kazuna manages to reach the clock to teleport with the boys. However, teleportation in Raphtalia is cancelled, and there it is revealed to us that this was planned by Kaio, since he wants to see how Naofumi suffers when separated from Raphtalia. And there Naofumi asks Kazuna to cancel the teleportation. However, Kazuna tells him that once activated, it cannot be cancelled. So in that, everyone, except Raphtalia, is transported to Sickle. And there Naofumi asks Kazuna to take them back to Mika. But then Kazuna mentions that the capital's clock has been closed, so these will not be able to return. And then the next day, Kazuna takes the boys to a friend of his named Ethno, who is the bearer of the ship's vassal weapon. And there Kazuna reveals that he specializes in searching for people, and in that, Ethno decides to create a familiar for Naofumi using a trait from Raphtalia, so Naofumi uses Raphtalia hair to create his familiar. And at that, Ethno begins the ceremony. And after this, we see how Naofumi's family member is born. and their Kazuna mentions that if Raphtalia dies, the family member does too. So at that point the boys realize that Raphtalia is still alive, which makes Naofumi calm down. And after this, Ethno takes the boys to a forest in Sickle where he summons his ship's vassal weapon. And once there, we see how Naofumi's relative discovers the location of Raphtalia, so Ethno decides to take the boys to the place where she is. And there Ethno leaves them in a safe area of Mika so as not to be discovered. So the boys thank him for his help. And then they start exploring the city, but at that moment Naofumi feels Philo's presence, so he starts looking for her. And in that Naofumi discovers that Philo has been captured as a slave in order to be used to attract new viewers, so upon witnessing this, Naofumi gets angry. And there he tries to kill the merchant who captured Philo, but then Rishia stops him and tells him that the best thing would be to save her at night, because if it causes a scandal, everyone could be hurt. So Naofumi decides to calm down. And then at night, we see how the boys infiltrate the merchant's store in order to find Philo, and there Naofumi notices that she has become a chick since in this world there are no Philolials, and in that Naofumi frees Philo from his cage. And then, he tortures the merchant who captured Philo as revenge. And after this, we see how the boys spend the night in the forest, where we see how Philo decides not to leave Naofumi, so Naofumi tells her that he will not leave her alone again. And then the next day, the boys decide to continue looking for Raphtalia, but there Naofumi notices that Raphtalia's slave seal has disappeared. So he realizes that something strange is happening. And at that moment we move several days ago, where we see how Raphtalia is sent to a place called the Shrinking Prison. And there she begins to remember Naofumi, but in that Raphtalia decides not to give up until she sees him again. And after this, Raphtalia is locked in a special cell which absorbs its energy, and then she realizes that inside the cell are Lark, Teresa and Glass. They fail to recognize her because she looks like a girl. But after talking to her, they realize that it is Raphtalia, so Lark is happy to see her. And in that Raphtalia reminds him that they are still enemies, but there she mentions that the truce between them still stands. So he proposes that they work together to escape from prison, what they accept. And then Lark reveals that they fell into Kaio's trap upon returning to their world, this being the reason why they are locked up in prison. And after this, Raphtalia tells them what she experienced since she came into this world. So there the boys find out that Kazuna was locked in the infinite labyrinth, so they are happy to find out that she was able to escape. And their Glass decides to help Raphtalia so that he can meet Naofumi. So at that point the boys talk to Raphtalia about the shrinking prison, which increases the strength of the guards through talismans. And their Raphtalia comes up with an idea to escape, and in that she tricks one of the guards using her illusion magic for him to enter their cell. And once there, Raphtalia steals his talisman to give it to Glass, which allows Glass to regain his strength in order to destroy the wall of his cell and be able to escape. And once outside, Lark mentions that they must meet with Kazuna and Naofumi. However, they must pass through the city of Mika to reach Sickle. And there Teresa tells Raphtalia that they will advance while fighting monsters so that Raphtalia can level up, and then she decides to sell her jewelry so she can buy food and armor, which allows them to fight various monsters along the way. And after this, the boys learn that a new wielder of the vassal katana has appeared. So Lark suggests that they go and see who will be the new bearer. And once there, Raphtalia realizes that it is Kazu who tries to take the vassal katana. However, she rejects him and then chooses Raphtalia as her carrier, which causes Naofumi's slave seal to disappear. And their Kazu orders Raphtalia to be captured for stealing the katana. And on the other hand, Raphtalia realizes that she cannot let go of the vassal katana, so she decides to escape without Lark and the others so as not to put them in danger. And meanwhile, Raphtalia begins to grow after becoming the wielder of the katana, which causes it to begin to move with difficulty as it does not get used to the change. But still, she manages to reach a temple where she meets a priestess who decides to help her, since his family has served the katana hero for generations. So she gives Raphtalia new clothes. And then, Raphtalia realizes that Kazu has arrived at the temple, so she decides to go out to face him, but before doing so, she thanks the priestess for helping her, which causes the priestess to feel honored by her words. And once outside, Raphtalia meets Kazu and his subordinates, and their Kazu demands that he return the vassal katana, since he believes he is the real bearer of the weapon. However, Raphtalia decides to refuse to give it to him, and then Kazu summons some sacred beasts called Byako to kill Raphtalia. However, she kills them with ease. And after this, Raphtalia gives Kazu a special cut, and there he tells him that if he moves, he will be cut in two, which causes Kazu to be forced to remain still, so that his subordinates can try to cure him from Raphtalia's attack. And their Raphtalia tries to escape from the temple with the little strength she has left. But then she meets a third Byako, who tries to kill her, and finding herself very weak, Raphtalia decides to accept her fate and die. However, Naofumi appears to save her along with the other girls. And then we see how Kazuna uses his sacred weapon to kill Byako with a single blow, which allows the girls to meet Raphtalia again, which is happy to meet everyone again. And after this, Raphtalia hugs Naofumi while telling him that he is back, so this welcomes him. And then we see how Lark and the girls meet Kazuna again, so they decide to return to Sickle. And on the other hand, we see how Kazu is still motionless inside the temple, and then Kaio appears in front of him to provoke him. So Kazu gets angry and moves, which causes it to be cut in two, so the subordinates are shocked after witnessing this. And their Kaio decides to use Kazu's corpse for his plans. And after this, he asks his childhood friend named Yomogi for help, so that he can murder Naofumi and the others. And back with Naofumi, we see how they return to Sickle thanks to Ethno. And once there, Kazuna finds out that his friends tried to kill Naofumi, since she still doesn't know anything about the waves. But in that, Kazuna proposes to Naofumi to form an alliance in order to discover another way to stop the waves and save both worlds, to which Naofumi accepts. And after this, it is revealed to us that Lark is the king of Sickle, so everyone is surprised to find out about this. And later, we see how Kazuna takes the boys to a blacksmith named Ramana, who is in charge of creating weapons and armor for everyone. And just then the boys hear a big scandal outside. So these decide to leave, and there they meet Yomogi, which prepares to fight alone against all the heroes, so Naofumi's group gets the advantage of the fight from the beginning. But then the boys notice that Yomogi's sword acts strangely, so Kazuna tells Yomogi that he should let her go. However, Yomogi decides to ignore her, and that the boys decide to fight together to separate Yomogi from his sword, which turned out to be a bomb made by Kaio to kill the heroes. So there Yomogi realizes that Kaio used her without caring about her. And after this, Kazuna decides to talk to Yomogi alone, which tells him about Kaio. So there she tells him that Kaio's goal is to stop the waves, so Kazuna decides to go talk to Kaio personally to resolve this conflict, which causes Yomogi to thank him. And then the next day, the boys receive the armor made by Ramana, which causes them to raise their statistics. But in that, we see how a wave suddenly appears in the world, and there Yomogi learns that Kaio did not plan to stop the waves, but rather cause them. And in that, Kazuna decides to fight in the wave with Lark, Teresa, and Glass. And on the other hand, Ethno takes Naofumi and the girls with Kaio in order to defeat him and be able to stop the wave of disaster. And then they arrive at Kaio's laboratory, but after advancing a little, they are stopped by Kazu's subordinates, which were turned into chimeras by Kaio to become stronger, since they were deceived by Kaio. So their Raphtalia decides to knock them out using his katana. And then we see how Kaio introduces himself to the boys, and there he reveals that he turned Kazu into a homunculus, which now possesses the spirit of the vassal mirror hero. So their Kazu's subordinates find out that he is already dead, which makes them sad, and their Raphtalia asks Naofumi and Rishia to take care of Kaio, since she, Philo, and Yomogi will be in charge of fighting Kazu, to which Naofumi accepts. And after this, he meets Kaio, which begins to provoke Naofumi, which causes Naofumi to get angry and invoke the Shield of Rage. So this one starts to lose control, and at that Rishia tries to make Naofumi stop, so she reminds him that he is not alone. And after this, Rishia decides to fight Kaio to give Naofumi time to recover. And meanwhile, we see how Naofumi has an internal struggle where he is about to succumb to hate, but at that moment Ost appears to help him regain consciousness. And then we see how Raphtalia and Philo appear next to Naofumi to help him. So Naofumi manages to recover, and in that he invokes the shield of the turtle spirit in order to defeat Kaio by shooting him with lightning. And in that, Naofumi increases his power thanks to the girls and the spirit of Ost, which allows him to finish off Kaio and stop the wave that he caused. And after this, Ost's spirit decides to say goodbye to the boys. And then Naofumi meets with the heroes of the other world to celebrate. However, he notices how he is about to return to his world. So Naofumi and the girls decide to say goodbye to Kazuna and the others. And once back, Naofumi finds out that the three heroes stopped the wave from their world. And then, Naofumi is named Viscount for having stopped the turtle. So after this, Naofumi decides to return to Lorelona with the girls. And so the anime ends.